Hey guys, welcome to the Great Debate Community. We're on a roll. We did one earlier today, and I was just in that one. We did a couple a few days ago, and on Friday and Saturday we're doing more with Aaron Raw. We've got him coming in to do a one-on-one on Friday, and then he'll be participating in a panel on Saturday. So we're on the roll today. We are doing the moral argument for the existence of God, and we actually only have a couple of people in here who are defending it. I'm hoping to get more apologists in the room as the debate progresses. But right now we've got one who's got a pretty good firm handle on it. It's Wade Tistammer. He's pursuing an undergraduate degree at the University of New Orleans. The degree is in philosophy. So yeah, we're talking about the moral argument. I think it's a pretty important argument because morality is something that is really central to a lot of our lives. So when Christian apologists talk about their favorite argument, they often use the moral argument because it's something that really hits home. You can go home and you can forget about the cosmological arguments, for example, but the moral argument is something that people remember because it really presses into their daily life. But yeah, we've got some Christians here and a few atheists, and a lot of them are pretty thoughtful. So hopefully we have a good interaction here. And I'll let Wade take it away. I'll let Wade present his argument, and then we'll get some interaction from our atheist friends. So hey, Wade, how's it going? How is everything?
All right, pretty good. All right, so first thing I'd like to do is define what I mean by morality. So morality has an ought component, like moral obligations, but there are a couple different senses of the word ought. So one way the ought could be used is descriptively, that type of ought that is nothing more than some purely descriptive state of affairs. So for example, if you want to do well in school, you ought to study, meaning something like as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. So that sort of is ought is descriptive. It's any ought that has no properties besides purely descriptive ones. Another type of ought that we could call a prescriptive ought is it's not a descriptive ought. It prescribes and is not purely descriptive, like you should not torture infants just for fun. So that's the sort of morality I'm talking about, that's prescriptive ought. It may seem obvious, but I've seen some redefine morality, so that's purely descriptive. So I wanted to get that out of the way. So moral oughts being prescriptive, it's important because that means that moral properties and facts are, if not supernatural, at least non-natural. So natural facts are those that can be expressed entirely in language of psychology and the natural sciences, like the atomic number of gold is 79 and Bob needs an anesthetic to not feel pain. So what this means is that, all natural facts are purely descriptive. They can be stated entirely in descriptive language. But moral facts are not purely descriptive. That is, it is false that moral oughts have no properties besides purely descriptive ones. And what that means, it follows from that moral oughts are not natural facts. So another indication that moral properties are non-natural is their empirical undetectability and causal inertness, at least barring the supernatural. To illustrate what I mean by moral oughtness being empirically undetectable, imagine a moral nihilist who disbelieves in moral oughtness and a moral realist who does believe in moral oughtness observes some jerk kicking a dog just for fun. The dog whimpers and pains and runs away. Now, both agree on all the physiological and psychological facts, like the dog feeling pain and suffering minor injury. So the moral nihilist says, I don't think moral oughtness, like moral wrongness, is attached to that action. The moral realist says, I think moral oughtness, like moral wrongness, is attached to that action. But there is no empirical way to determine who is right here. Both sides agree on all the same empirically observable facts. And moral oughtness being associated with certain physical facts, like the dog's injury, doesn't explain any physical fact. So moral realism and moral nihilism are empirically indistinguishable from each other. Though since moral oughtness is non-natural and non-physical, it isn't surprising that the moral realist and moral nihilist would agree on all the same physical facts. And the dog kicker scenario also illustrates that moral oughtness is causally inert, at least barring the supernatural. Moral oughtness is non-natural, non-physical, and something non-physical causally influencing the natural physical realm would be supernatural. Now, here's where the argument for moral knowledge comes into play, because if moral properties like moral wrongness are empirically undetectable and causally inert, barring the supernatural, how in the world are we aware of morality? Now, since morality is empirically undetectable, in practice, we have to rely on intuition. That is, it just seems true to us that morality exists. It just seems true to us that there's something morally wrong with torturing if it's just for fun. Similar how it just seems true to us that the external world is real, as opposed to being something like a dream. But if we have to rely on moral intuition to justify our belief in morality, how does moral intuition deliver warrant for morality's existence? So warrant being that stuff that you add to true belief to get knowledge, like evidence or justification. So theism has a straightforward explanation for our moral awareness. God, wanting humans to have moral knowledge, designed our cognitive faculties, by evolution or otherwise, in such a way that when they are functioning properly, we intuitively apprehend basic moral truths, just as we intuitively apprehend elementary truths of logic and arithmetic. So our moral awareness becomes a kind of God-given intuitive knowledge. Now, in contrast, atheism faces a real problem. Moral properties are causally inert in the absence of the supernatural, and because on atheism, it's unlikely that supernatural intervention is responsible for our moral knowledge. So, for example, supernatural clairvoyance seems far-fetched. It's likely that moral oughtness is causally inert if atheism is true. So, that's a real problem, because if moral oughtness being causally inert means its presence or absence would make no causal difference as to whether our brains would give us this moral intuition, nor would it make any causal difference to the evolutionary environmental processes that gave us our brains. But if on atheism we would have the intuition of morality existing, even if morality did not exist, then it would seem that we don't know that morality exists if atheism is true. So the argument is, I guess I should probably explain why that follows. So why would it matter if we would have the intuition that morality exists, even if morality did not exist? To illustrate this, supposing a cyborg knows she has a metal detecting implant installed in her brain, designed so that when a widget is in her hand, the implant delivers a strong intuition that the widget contains metal, if and only if it contains metal. But suppose the metal detecting implant malfunctions, such that it would deliver the intuition that the widget in her hand contains metal, regardless of whether the widget contained metal. Well, then even if the widget in her hand contained metal, and she believed it contained metal on the basis of her intuition, her belief wouldn't count as knowledge. So moreover, if she learned the metal detecting implant would give her the intuition that the widget contains metal, regardless of whether the widget contained metal, she would no longer have adequate grounds to believe the widget contains metal. So the argument is this. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. Premise 2. Moral knowledge does exist. For example, we do know that it's morally wrong to torture if it's just for fun. Conclusion, therefore God exists. And that's the argument in a nutshell.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of problems there. First of all, I don't see why the fact that you would want moral properties to be causal would require that they would have to be natural, right? You could have causally non-natural, you could have non-natural properties that engage in causal relations.
You could, but that
wouldn't require a God, right?
You could.
So that would be one issue. And then I think another issue is I'm not really seeing how theism provides an explanation, right? Because it's consistent with theism to design human beings that don't correctly perceive moral properties, right? So there's nothing about the theistic hypothesis that predicts that we should actually have these kinds of faculties, right?
Right. So your first problem, you could say that it's a very common objection against moral non-naturalism, that how do we know that moral properties exist? Because moral properties being non-natural, non-physical, it seems like they would be causally inert, at least barring the supernatural. So for
I don't see why.
Because the non-physical forces, non-physical
they don't have to be physical for them to be causal, right?
Hold on. Let's let one another finish the points and then interact.
Okay. So what I said earlier is that the type of morality I'm talking about that I just described earlier, I made an argument for, is that the type of morality that I'm talking about, that the morality is, that the moral argument for moral knowledge is talking about, is non-physical. So
yeah, I'm talking about non-physical. I'm talking about non-physical morality too. Like take sensibility theory, right? That's a non-naturalist form of morality, of a meta. It's a non-naturalist meta-ethical view. It takes non-moral properties to be non-natural, but it understands them to be causal, right?
Well, if it's non-physical and non-natural, anything non-physical causally influencing the physical realm would have to be, by definition, supernatural.
No, it would be non-natural.
Non-physical forces influencing the physical world would not be supernatural?
That's right. They would be non-natural.
Well, I guess we'll have to agree. I suppose it depends on your semantics of what it means to be supernatural.
Well, I'm just using the standard semantics, right? The idea is that what non-naturalism is the thesis that not all properties that exist are properties that are studied by the natural sciences, right? Or reducible to properties that are studied by the natural sciences, right? So there's plenty of atheist non-naturalists, right? And they deny the supernatural, but they're not naturalists. Right?
Okay, and your second point about theism not explaining anything. It should first be pointed out what the actual argument is. It's a deductive argument that doesn't really use theism to explain anything. The argument
I thought in your introduction you said theism offers an explanation.
Well, it does have an explanation for how we can know that morality exists. The explanation.
I'm not seeing how it can explain
All right,
the phenomenon if it doesn't actually predict the phenomenon, right?
Well, it's easy to find. Okay, on theism, we can conceive of an explanation that's reasonably possible on theism.
Well, when you say reasonably possible, what do you mean? You mean it's logically possible?
Well, not just logically possible, but it's, given theism, it's reasonable. It's reasonably possible.
Reasonable
it's easily
in
within
virtue
God's
of what?
capability to do
Reasonable,
this. If we
no.
accept it.
No, well, I'm not denying that it's possible for God to design people to have moral. Well, I'm for the sake of argument, I won't deny it. I mean, I think it's not clear to me how God could have moral knowledge. But
well, he's omniscient, so he would know everything. If he existed.
that's just to define him as knowing moral properties. That doesn't explain how those properties, how those beliefs that he has are justified, right? Like if I say
that's true, but it's not really meant to.
What do you mean it's not meant to? I said I didn't understand how God could have moral knowledge, right? And you saying that he's omniscient isn't an answer to the question, right?
Well, that kind of is open to another different can of worms. But
yeah, so just for the sake of argument, let's grant that God could design beings that have the ability to perceive or to have moral knowledge, to correctly know, to have correct moral beliefs, right? Something like that, right? The fact that that's possible doesn't mean that it's expected on the hypothesis.
But it's irrelevant to the argument. The deductive argument is this. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist.
Yeah, but
premise 2.
But we've already challenged that premise, right?
All right. So, well, think about it. My point is that on atheism, in practice, we would have this intuition that non-physical moral oughtness exists, regardless of whether it existed.
Yeah.
Because the type of moral oughtness I described would be non-physical.
Yeah.
And, well, think of it another way. Suppose, for example, all the physical properties were the same, but moral oughtness did not exist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, barring supernatural intervention, would that change the physical outcome? The answer is no, because we'd have the same physical conditions resulting in the same physical outcomes.
If there were non-natural properties, it would change the physical outcomes, right?
Well, how would that work? Suppose prescriptive moral oughtness did not exist. How would that change the physical outcome exactly?
If, in fact, there are moral properties that are non-natural that interact with the physical world in some way, right, then you're going to get different outcomes, presumably, if those properties don't exist.
Well, how would that happen exactly? It doesn't seem on the surface.
What do you mean, how does it happen? We don't need to offer an explanation for how it would happen, right? You haven't given an argument to show that it's not possible.
Well, it didn't say it was not possible. It does appear to me.
I thought that was what your first premise. I thought your first premise is based on the idea that it's not possible.
Well, it's not very, no, not possibility, probability. Given atheism,
Well, wait a minute. Why would it be improbable? I'm not seeing that either.
the idea that non-physical moral oughtness would causally influence the physical world does not appear plausible.
Why? It's an intuition you have? Is that all you can offer? Because some people's intuitions will go the other way. So
Well,
that's not
true.
going to be a very
Some people's
interesting...
intuitions don't even have the idea that moral knowledge exists. I mean, you could.
Yeah, so I'm not sure why. I'm not seeing why you would appeal to intuitions. Then,
yeah, I
right?
mean, you could have.
Do you have an argument for the claim rather than an appeal to an intuition? Is my question.
You could have a different intuition. You could have the intuition that the number 6, although an abstract object and non-physical, can causally influence the world in some way.
I'm not seeing the relevance of that, right? I asked you, right? You said that it's not very plausible that non-natural properties could interact with physical properties. And I asked you why, and
because
you just said it's an intuition.
Well, because the non-natural moral properties in questions would be non-physical.
So what? Why couldn't non-natural properties interact with physical properties?
Because they are non-physical, and the non-physical.
But we've already said that. So why is it that because they're non-physical, they couldn't interact with physical properties?
The same reason the number 6 could not causally influence.
No. Number 6 is an abstract object, right? We're talking about concrete properties, not abstract properties.
Well, I'm not really sure that we are talking about concrete properties.
Yeah, we are talking about concrete properties because by stipulation, they engage in causal relations.
Okay.
Wait a minute. What causal relations are you talking about?
I'm saying that value properties, right, can be understood to be non-natural properties and can causally interact with the natural world, which is to say the physical world.
Okay, right? So value properties...
I'm not seeing any argument that that's not possible.
Yeah, so value properties causally interact with the natural world, doing what, like imposing themselves on people, like telling people...
People can perceive them, and that will alter their actions.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so this non-physical moral oughtness, I mean, in what way does it causally interact? I mean, does it somehow alter the neurochemical reactions of our brain?
I don't see what difference it makes what the mechanism is.
Well, I didn't say the mechanism. I'm just saying.
I thought that you had some kind of argument that, or might have some kind of argument that it's not plausible, rather than a mere appeal to an intuition.
I think...
Is there an argument for that or not?
The mechanism might matter a little, because if you think about what human beings are, like the whole process of human evolution, coming out of the ocean and everything like that, I guess the question would be, why is it that we would come to interact with these non-physical moral properties?
I don't see what difference it makes.
Yeah, it's possibility. He's showing that it's possible. He has to overcome that.
I think he just asserted it.
Well, wait a minute. I thought your claim was that it wasn't plausible, and I was asking you for an argument for that. The best you had to offer was that it was unintuitive, which is of no interest, right? Now, is there an argument or not? That's what I'm asking. Otherwise, withdraw the claim that it's not plausible.
I don't think I need to withdraw the claim that it's implausible.
So is it implausible? Is your claim that it's implausible justified in virtue of a mere intuition, or do you have an argument in support of the claim?
I'll be honest, this is not an objection that I anticipated, the idea that non-physical moral oughtness would causally influence the physical world. I don't have an argument.
It's perfectly fair that you haven't anticipated, and it's nothing. There's nothing shameful about the fact that you haven't anticipated. I'm merely saying, and I'm not rebuking you for not having anticipated. I'm merely saying that if you're going to make the claim that non-natural moral properties are implausible, you need to offer an argument for that.
Oh, I didn't say non-natural moral properties were implausible. I think they're quite
non-natural moral properties that causally interact with the physical is not plausible. You need to give an argument for that. Otherwise, I don't see what justifies the claim.
All right. Well, I guess we would have to agree to disagree on whether.
Well, it's not a question of agreeing to disagree, right? I'm merely asking you if you have an argument for the claim. If you don't have an argument for the claim, then you're just saying it doesn't seem plausible to me, which is of no interest, right?
Well, as I tried to mention earlier, I can't think of an argument on the top of my head that on
Okay, so then you don't have a justification that it's not plausible. So we can leave aside that objection because there isn't any. You don't have a way of supporting that objection right now. You'll have to work on that in the future. So I don't really see how your argument goes through then.
Well, I think it is justified, but people
wait a
have
minute.
different...
When I asked you,
hold on, Jack. Sorry, you keep interrupting him. I just want to let him finish.
Okay.
Why do you think it's justified?
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask.
Okay. To me, it seems intuitively plausible on atheism that non-physical moral oughtness causally influencing the physical world. That idea seems implausible to me, just as it seems implausible.
Yeah, but we've been over that, right? We pointed out that that's not an argument. That's just an appeal.
I didn't say that was an
intuition.
argument.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So you don't have a justification other than your intuition. I don't really see how intuitions justify. So I think
I can give you an example.
Discard the objection.
Well, intuitions do justify.
How?
Well, for example, we intuitively perceive that 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah, and how does that justify the claim?
Well, you could go by something akin to the principle of phenomenal conservatives, and we're justified.
Yeah, but I don't understand how phenomenal conservatism isn't actually appealing to something that we might call schmustification rather than justification, right?
Well, because
you have to explain that to me.
If you don't, then
we can take the example of ordinary forms of justification, right? Inferential forms, right? So let's look at how those work, right? So in the case of evidential justifications, we understand that they justify in virtue of raising the probability that some outcome is true. X is evidence for A because X raises the probability of A being true, and A raises the probability of X being true. So if you encounter X, right, X raises the probability of A. So that's how it justifies. Now, the same is true of a deductive argument. It raises the probability. If the premises are true, it raises the probability to 1, right?
Well, that's very interesting.
In the case of intuitions, right, as phenomenal conservatives, proponents of phenomenal conservatism appeal to, right, I'm not seeing how intuitions raise the probability of an outcome being true.
That's very interesting. Right? So what's your justification for the rule of logic known as modus ponens?
I don't give a justification for it. I don't think it requires one.
So you don't think you're justified in believing modus ponens is a valid form of inference?
If somebody said, how would I justify it, what could I say? That I have the intuition that it's true?
Maverick, how do you define intuition?
An intuition is just a pre-theoretical seeming.
Well, intuition is something that the consciousness immediately, in philosophy, intuition is something that the consciousness immediately apprehends or directly
But is it
perceives.
objectively true or subjectively true?
Like,
in
for
all
example,
situations.
So an example of something of intuition would be how we intuitively perceive elementary truths of logic and mathematics. So it's kind of how we mentally see that 1 + 1 = 2.
Well,
yeah, but
that's
is that always true?
It's a claim
based on intuition.
That you're seeing them in virtue of their truth, right, rather than just believing them.
So another example would be how we intuitively perceive that modus ponens is a valid form of inference. Modus ponens goes, if P then Q, P therefore Q. We just sort of see that that's true.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
Right.
But hold on,
Jack, sorry, go ahead.
Can we give that to him though? I mean, even if we give up like a really thick realist view of intuition, it still doesn't mean that I'm going to accept his intuition that it makes more sense on theism.
The intuition,
so even
if intuitions could justify, it's not clear why that would be of any value when intuitions can go the other way, right? So for somebody who has the opposite intuitions, right, your claim that it's plausible is that the existence of such properties is implausible is going to be completely inert, right?
That's
so
true.
I think that's the point. So I see. I don't see why it's useful. I don't see why it's useful to appeal to intuitions, given that problem, right? And that's why I'm asking you if you have an argument. But it sounds like you're conceding you don't have an argument, right? So I think we can just put that objection aside until you have one. I think it's not going to move somebody with opposite intuitions, right?
Well, that is
Your
true.
appeal isn't going to move somebody with opposite intuitions.
Just like I can't give an argument against the idea that the number 6 would cause me to trip and fall down.
But I don't think anybody disagrees with that.
Can I add?
But you never know. I mean, it's philosophy.
I disagree with you. I disagree with you that such properties are implausible, right? So you telling me that it's unintuitive is not going to move me. Right.
Yeah, Jack, I agree with you in a sense. At the same time, I think, and you might even agree with this, I think intuitions can be useful for your own personal justification.
Yeah, but I'm not denying that.
Yeah. So, okay, so you agree that for your own personal justification, intuitions.
Well, I just take that. That seems to me basically a descriptive claim, right? It's just sort of saying that my prior probabilities favor A rather than B.
Yeah.
Right? Which is fine. I'm not saying that you should abandon your prior probabilities if I don't have a counter argument. Right? Yeah. I'm just saying that somebody saying my prior probabilities favor A isn't going to move me if my prior probabilities favor B. Right? And that seems like that's all that Wade has to offer, which I don't think is of any interest.
Okay, so one objection against this argument is that maybe non-physical moral oughtness somehow causally interacts in the physical realm, and that somehow we know morality that way. And people can agree to disagree on how plausible that idea is. And it doesn't seem plausible to me, but maybe it seems plausible to you.
Maverick, I also think there are arguments in favor of that view, but that's beside the point. Right?
Well, it would be sort of relevant if you wanted to show that the first premise is false.
Well, no. See, there's no reason for anybody to accept the first premise unless they share your intuition. Right?
Yeah.
Well, there are other ways to justify the first premise. I just
Jack, are you arguing that this notion that non-material causal moral properties are plausible or possible? Which one are you arguing?
Oh, my view is that they exist, and that there's no really credible alternative. But I don't need to make that claim, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So
the argument, right? Okay, I need to get him to establish that there couldn't be properties of that kind, or it's very unlikely there could be properties of that kind, and he doesn't have an argument for that, right? So it doesn't seem like his argument goes through.
Yeah. Maybe
unless somebody accepts that premise. You know?
Well, maybe you could repeat what you said earlier when I kind of brought up this thing about how human beings came to interact with these non-causal moral properties. Because if they exist, then you would also have to assume that human beings are somehow interacting with them. And given that human beings are just like a speck of dust inside this big universe, like what is the nature of them? Are we discovering them like we discover mathematics, or?
No, I don't think it's like mathematics.
Okay. How do we go about?
I think it's similar. I think it's similar to semantics. So when somebody says the cat is on the mat, right? I don't think that we infer the meaning of the sentence there. I think we perceive the semantic property, so we just perceive its meaning, right? So in the same way, I think that we perceive the wrongness of an action or the desirability of a piece of cake and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. Would that, and I'm not I'm not raising an argument against this by saying this, but would that be a reliance on intuitions when you're perceiving in that way?
Well, if you were asked to justify your beliefs, all you could do is say that's how it seems.
Yeah.
Right?
So, yeah, the idea that if moral oughtness did not exist, somehow that would affect evolutionary development. Yeah, it's a little bit All right, so there are other ways to justify the first premise beyond just accepting the intuition that if non-physical moral oughtness were not to have existed, the physical outcome would have been the same. One is to try to find what is the kind of best explanation for the fact that we do believe it.
But you see, that's a problem because theism doesn't actually give you an explanation for the reason that I offered, right? It doesn't actually predict the outcome that you have in mind.
Well, that's irrelevant.
Right? No, it is irrelevant. It is relevant because you're saying that you can justify the first premise by an abductive appeal, right? And in order for there to be an abductive appeal,
that wasn't
to an
my
explanation.
Well, what do you mean when you said what's the best explanation?
Okay, hold on. Let's just let Wade.
I was going to explain, but unfortunately I was interrupted.
Let me make a moderator note. I think this is one of the problems with when people come in and they're diagnosed with interrupteritis. When you have that, then you don't let the other person's point get across, and you're not.
Well, I mean, the reason why I'm interrupting is to save time, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm trying. It's actually a form of respect, not disrespect, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to prevent him.
It doesn't always come up. It doesn't always come up that way, though.
I understand that, but let me explain. I'm trying to prevent him from wasting his time and everybody else's time by saying something irrelevant when I can see that that's where he's going.
Yeah, but that kind of says to the other person that you're talking to that what you are saying isn't worth hearing.
This is getting kind of meta, you guys.
I just said the opposite.
Look, he said that it's the best explanation. And when someone says this is the best explanation, well, what did you say then?
Okay, so here was where I was going to go before I was interrupted. Is that okay? If atheism is true, what is the best explanation for moral knowledge? I was not going to say theism for obvious reasons, because if atheism is true, theism is not going to be the best explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going to argue on, okay, if atheism is true, what is the best explanation? I was going to argue that the best explanation for why we have our moral beliefs isn't because they are morally correct, but simply because they are advantageous for our survival.
Why? How would you argue that?
All right, so unfortunately I was not quite prepared to argue this, so...
I mean, I don't see how you could argue that it seems hard for me to believe that you could, in almost any case, argue that the best explanation for us having some property, for an organism having some trait, is because it contributed to reproductive efficiency.
All right, so
how could you, in almost any circumstance, provide evidence for that claim?
All right, one advantage. So this is this has been called the adaptive link account. That the reason why you have these beliefs is because it's adaptive. And
yeah, what's the argument?
All right, so another alternative is it's truth tracking, that our brains evolve the intuition because it's true. So one advantage that the adaptive link, or there are a number of advantages that it has, is that it's more parsimonious, it's much clearer. Again, it seems to shed more light on the explanandum, the thing to be explained in question, that human beings tend to make it some evaluative judgments rather than others.
Is it an ad hoc explanation or not?
The adaptive link account?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, we have all these.
So if it's not an ad hoc account, then presumably it generates some kind of novel predictions, right? That would independently justify it.
Yeah, in a way it does.
I don't see how it does that. How does it do that?
Well, it predicts that the evaluative judgments we'd make are conducive to our survival.
No. That's already built into the hypothesis, right? That you're already saying the reason why it's there is because it conduces to our survival, right? I was asking you for independent justification, right, of the hypothesis that that's the reason why it moved to fixation in an ancestral population, right? The hypothesis is that the reason why it did so was because it contributed to reproductive efficiency, right, in ancestral members of the population. Now, what I'm asking is, how is that claim not ad hoc? What is the independent justification for that claim?
Well, there are several pieces of justification. One is that we do actually have these evaluated judgments are in fact conducive for survival.
No. That's the claim that I'm asking. You are saying, right, the best explanation is that for the fact that we have these traits is because they contributed to reproductive efficiency, right? Now, I take it that you can show, if that hypothesis is to have any plausibility at all, I take it that you'll be able to construct an evolutionary story by which it would contribute to reproductive efficiency. That's not what I'm challenging. Whether you have independent justification for that.
The second piece of evidence is that it is more parsimonious than the tracking.
Yeah, but that's not a prediction. That's not a prediction, right?
Well, that might be true.
I'm asking you whether it predicts some kind of novel fact.
Well, I suppose it depends on whether you think that the fact that we have these traits that are conducive to survival is a novel fact or not.
No.
Okay.
No, it's designed to explain that fact. The hypothesis is designed to explain that fact. So I'm asking what else it explains besides what it's designed to explain.
Well, no, it's designed to explain why we have the evaluative, basic tendency for our judgments.
Look, do you understand what a just so story is?
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm asking you is, how is this not a just so story?
Well, because that doesn't give it a specific evolutionary account. I haven't given any.
Yeah, but the point is, what a just so story is, right, is a plausible story, right, that predicts and explains some phenomenon that's unexplained without that story, right? But it's a just so story because we don't actually have any independent evidence for it.
Okay, I should remind you that what I'm claiming here is that the adaptive linking count is a better explanation than the tracking account.
Well, I was asking you whether it was ad hoc or not, right?
Well, I don't think it is because we have plenty of evidence for evolution.
No. What's not in question is whether there's evidence for evolution. What's in question is whether for a given trait, right, any explanatory story that we provide for how that trait may have moved to fixation in an ancestral population in virtue of its contribution to reproductive efficiency, right, how that story is not merely a just so story, right? That's the question.
I thought your question whether it was ad hoc or not.
Maverick.
By ad hoc, I mean that it's a just so story.
Maverick, he's simply asking
those mean the same thing. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I just want to clarify because, I think you guys are kind of like overcomplicating it. I think it would be more sufficient to just talk a little more colloquially. Basically, Maverick, all that Jack is saying is that if we all, just for the sake of this argument, assume that Darwinian evolution is true, how can you prove, or what is your evidence for the assertion that, certain moral judgments serve the purpose of, increasing reproductive efficiency? Like, what is the evidence for that? What actual biological evidence do you have to prove that fact?
All right, so, as I was mentioning before, why I think the adaptive link is better than the tracking count. It's more parsimonious. It's much clearer. It seems to show...
Based on what?
On which one are you challenging, or whether it's parsimonious or not?
No, you say it's better than his argument. Is it better on the basis of evidence, better on the basis of emotion, better on the basis of what?
Okay, so better on the basis, one is that it's more parsimonious. All else held constant, simpler theories, simpler explanations are better than more complex ones. It also it's much clearer. It sheds more light on the explanation in question. Like, we can kind of conceive of what it means for, it works for our survival, so natural selection kind of selected for that.
No, okay, but what is your evidence for that?
What's the evidence for? No, I just said, okay, it's clearer. We can understand.
Look, for any trait that I have a hypothesis about, right, where I say that let's offer the hypothesis that what explains this trait being generalized in a population is that it has some contribution to reproductive efficiency. And let's say I construct an explanatory story for how that could be the case, right? I can imagine how it might contribute. It have contributed to reproductive efficiency in a ancestral population, right? Now, if some skeptic comes along and says, well, wait a minute, what's your evidence that it's not a ride-along trait, right? What could they do? What kind of evidence could they offer?
A ride-along trait.
A ride-along trait meaning a trait that's coextensive with some other trait that might have moved to fixation in an ancestral population because it contributed to reproductive efficiency.
Well, we can just examine the trait in question. It really would depend on the trait. So,
see, I don't think there's any way you could give evidence for that without a time machine, because what you'd have to do, delink the two traits, right? Deconfound them and place members of the ancestral population in the original evolutionary environment and look and see, right, which trait moved to fixation. And then the one of the two delinked traits that moved to fixation, you'd have evidence that that's the reason why it moved to fixation in an ancestral population. But you see, we can't run an experiment of that kind. So I don't see how any hypothesis about a trait being adaptive, right, is anything other than a just so story.
Maverick, I have a question for you.
It might well be a just so story, but that wouldn't negate the...
Well, but you see, the problem with it being a just so story is that we really don't have a good reason to accept ad hoc explanations. Right?
Well, I think you're defining ad hoc in a little bit idiosyncratic way.
By ad hoc, I mean that the hypothesis doesn't have justification independent from the phenomenon it is designed to explain.
Well, it does. It does have, because previously...
Does it predict a novel fact?
Well,
does it predict a fact other than the fact that it's designed to explain? That's what I'm asking.
Yes.
Okay, so give me an example of an adaptive hypothesis, right, that predicts a novel fact.
Well, it depends what you mean by novel fact, but it does predict certain things.
What I mean by a novel fact, right, is something that we didn't know about beforehand, right? We didn't know to look for, right, except in virtue of this hypothesis. So an example of that would be the phenomenon of light bending around massive objects, right? Because when Einstein developed the theory of relativity, what he was trying to accommodate were anomalous data that had emerged in the Michelson-Morley experiment, right, which was inconsistent with the ether hypothesis, right? So he didn't think that you could salvage, well, presumably, he didn't think that the ether hypothesis could be salvaged, right, to accommodate that data. So he tried to rethink the whole problem, right? And he came up with a mathematical model that accommodated the data of the Michelson-Morley experiment, right? But see, that would have just meant that his hypothesis was ad hoc if all it did was provide a formal model that explained the phenomenon in question, right? But you see, it did something else. It actually predicted that light would bend around the sun or bend around massive objects like stars, right? And so it was possible to independently test the hypothesis by going and looking to see if light bent around the sun, because nobody ever thought, oh, light bends around in the presence of gravitational fields, massive gravitational fields, right? So that was taken as strong confirmation of the hypothesis, and therefore the hypothesis was not seen to be ad hoc, right? So I'm just asking you if you have an independent test of that kind that would make your hypothesis not ad hoc.
Well, I suppose if by novel fact you mean all the facts that it doesn't already predict, then no.
Okay, so then it's an ad hoc hypothesis.
Hey, hold on. Let's let Wade chew on this for a little while. I want to get Ned
Sure.
involved, and then maybe we can circle
I
back.
didn't even explain my.
Okay, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we should probably explain what my claim is, because I didn't really get a chance to explain it. So there's a couple different accounts to explain why we have the moral beliefs we have. One is called the tracking account. So if, for example, we're asked to observe certain tendencies for our own survival and our offspring valuable, we tend to judge that we have a special obligation to our children, for example. The tracking count answers that these judgments are true and that it promoted reproductive sex to grasp these truths. Whereas the adaptive link account would be, no, the only reason that we have these beliefs is that just because it promoted our survival, not because it was advantageous to grasp the truths that this moral oughtiness exists. So that's why I was kind of saying what advantage that the tracking count has over one advantage the adaptive link account has over the tracking count is that it's more parsimonious. It could just say, well, the only reason is that it just promoted for our survival, reproductive success, and that's it. So my claim is that the adaptive link account is a better explanation than the tracking account.
But the problem is that neither hypothesis seems to be a particularly good hypothesis because they're both ad hoc, right?
Well, depending on how you define ad hoc.
Well,
we're using a little bit different definitions.
Well, ad hoc, as far as I know, it means an unevidenced proposition that is meant to serve your theory, to circumvent the evidence.
Well, yeah, usually I think of it as the theory that normally when I think of ad hoc hypothesis is a hypothesis that's added to explain away something and there's no independent evidence for that hypothesis.
I'm not talking about an auxiliary hypothesis, right?
Which,
I'm saying that an ad hoc hypothesis is a just so story, right? Because all it does is explain what it's designed to explain.
Well, we also have, we have a lot of good evidence for the adaptive link account.
Well, that's what I was asking you for, right?
But except that the evidence I give for it, you dismiss and saying that's not a novel fact, which doesn't seem like a fair objection.
Why?
I think a very substantive one.
Now, look, if I said to you, right, that I left my shoes outside my bedroom, right, and I woke up in the morning and they were gone, right? Why couldn't I just say that given that the shoe-stealing fairy hypothesis predicts that shoes should disappear, that isn't a good explanation for my shoes?
Well, the reason is because there's no independent evidence for it.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
But that isn't the case here. We have a lot of evidence for evolution and natural selection. We are appealing to a known mechanism that we already know exactly exists.
It's not in question.
If you had evidence that fairies exist and that fairies do steal things
it's
sometimes.
Not in question that there's evolution taking place, right? That's not what I'm questioning.
Jack, kind of for the audience, because honestly, I was looking at something else and you guys lost me a little. I'm not sure where we are. Like, could you catch me and the audience?
Where we are is, right, that I'm claiming that just so stories are not good explanations, right? Mm-hmm. What we want in a good explanation, right, is going to be something like predictive novelty, right? At least in the typical case. We're going to want something like predictive novelty because otherwise we're just going to have a hypothesis that's gerrymandered merely to explain what we already know.
Yeah, I get.
It's not actually going to be informative.
Yeah, I get that we're talking about just so stories, but can you do me a favor and just connect it to where we are in the debate?
Well, the hypotheses that Wade are offering just seem to be just so stories.
Okay.
Right. And so I'm asking him whether there's any way to independently verify one hypothesis over some rival by, for instance, showing some novel fact that's predicted by the hypothesis.
And I use things like simplicity, that it would be a simpler explanation. Okay, let's go back a little bit further. So we have, is there a relation between the workings of natural selection and our evaluative moral statements? There either is or there isn't. So if there isn't, then it would just be really a matter of luck that our intuitions happen to line up with what these.
No, that doesn't follow. That doesn't follow. That's a non sequitur. Right?
What's a non sequitur?
It could be because of an unknown mechanism, right?
Okay, so is there a relation between the workings of natural selection that give us our cognitive faculties or is there not?
Seems to me very unlikely.
Okay, so there's no relation between the, all right, so it's unlikely that there is a relation between the workings of natural selection and our moral truths.
Yes, that's my view, because I don't really see how, if we understand moral beliefs to be non-natural properties, I don't really see how a naturalistic process like natural selection, if there were such a thing, could get a grip on them.
Okay, well then, if that's the case, then the forces of natural selection, it seems, would be viewed as a purely distorting influence on our evaluative judgments, pushing us
I
our
don't see
evaluative.
why.
Huh?
I don't
Yeah.
see why that would follow.
Yeah.
All right, well, think of it. There's no relation between natural selection. Our natural selection, suppose, for example, natural selection pushes us towards, evaluative statement A. Whereas,
I don't see why we should think that natural selection is more likely to push us one way or another, or to push us at all.
That's exactly my point.
Right, so I think then from a probabilistic standpoint, we should treat it as a matter of indifference.
I agree. That is actually where I was going.
Okay.
So now, suppose it is a matter of difference. Well, then it's possible that as a matter of sheer chance, a large portion of our moral judgments ended up true due to a happy coincidence between the, moral realist independent moral truths and the evaluative directions that natural selection tends to push us. But it seems to require a fluke of luck that's very unlikely, and also very astoundingly convenient for the moral realist.
You're just making an argument from ignorance there, right?
Well, no, because you said we treat it as a matter of indifference.
There could be an explanation. There could be an explanation that we don't know about, right? That's non-supernatural.
Well, no, there couldn't, unless you define supernatural differently from how I'm defining it.
No, the point is you haven't established that there couldn't be an explanation other than the ones you've proposed that's not supernatural. You're merely saying that it seems to you like there couldn't be one, right? And that's no good.
No,
you have to give an argument.
I did give an argument.
What's the argument? What's the argument, right? That our moral beliefs correctly track the moral facts, right, is not possible. There couldn't be a non-supernatural explanation for that other than an appeal to natural selection.
Yeah, Jack, I don't know if you actually have to go that far. I don't know if you have to show that, like, for the argument to be at least persuasive, I don't know that you would have to show that it's not possible. In a lot of debates...
He's not even giving an argument that it's not plausible.
Well, okay,
He's just saying
let me
doesn't
tell you
seem
what
probable to him.
Yeah, let me tell you what I mean. Like, in a lot of these debates, what you'll do is survey a few possible naturalistic models and let the other debater propose their own model. But I don't think it's...
Well,
like,
let me explain to you why I'm making this objection, right?
Yeah.
My view is that there are no theistic explanations that predict the phenomena that they're purporting to explain, right, that are not merely ad hoc, if empirically confirmed, right? So what that means, so unless somebody can come up with an explanation like that, right, a theistic explanation can never be preferred to a non-theistic position, right, unless you can give a positive argument, right, that in fact it's not possible or likely that there could be a non-supernatural explanation. But the problem is that's going to be an argument from ignorance, right, which is a fallacy.
Okay, so here's the argument.
I don't think this whole strategy, is stillborn, right? Because he's not going to be able to come up with a supernatural explanation that isn't ad hoc.
All right, so here's my argument that a non-supernatural explanation is not possible. And this has to do with how I'm defining the word supernatural. So my semantics of what I mean by supernatural is such that a non-physical force causally influencing the physical world constitutes supernatural. Now, you are apparently using...
that just means the same thing as non-natural, right? But that doesn't involve theism.
Well, that doesn't... Well, normally non-natural means something else. It means something like isn't part of the world that the natural sciences discover. So that's compatible with moral Platonism, for example. But Platonic objects are causally inert. They wouldn't cause anything. They wouldn't cause.
Yeah, but I was imagining value properties that weren't causally inert, that were non-natural, right? So you'd need to be able to say, you'd need to be able to give an argument that would favor a theistic non-naturalist account over a non-theistic, that is to say, an atheistic non-naturalist account. So what would that argument be?
That would be a different claim from what I just described. I was just saying I had justification for the idea that you would require some sort of supernatural intervention. Now you could say that, oh yeah, there is some sort of supernatural dimension, and we've kind of agreed to disagree on the plausibility. But back to the evolutionary part. So how my argument was that if moral properties are non-natural and it's natural selection that pushes us to having our certain beliefs, then if natural selection is indifferent on the matter, that there's no link between the selective forces that influence the content of our moral judgments on the one hand and the moral truths that moral realism says exists, then it would be just a matter of very fortunate chance that our large portion of our moral judgments end up true due to a happy coincidence between...
It's not necessarily a matter of chance, because there could be explanation in virtue of an unknown mechanism, right?
Well, it would be very fortunate that there is this unknown mechanism that happens to steer us towards true rather than false.
Well, that's just trivializing the idea of fortunate, right? We could say it's fortunate, right, that objects actually attract each other, right, by gravitation. You could say that's fortunate, right? What wouldn't be fortunate on that?
Well, the reason why I say fortunate, where fortune seems apropos here, is that the idea that there is some sort of unknown supernatural force that steers us towards correct moral beliefs seems severely ad hoc.
I don't think you're understanding the objection. Okay, let me see if I can spell it out for you. Right, we have a phenomenon that we're seeking to explain. Right. So in this case, the phenomenon is that in
this case, the phenomenon is moral beliefs.
Right, moral beliefs. That's the phenomenon we're seeking to explain. Right. Now,
moral knowledge, not moral beliefs. It can't be.
Well, no, in this case, with this evolutionary argument, the argument that I'm talking about, I'm saying, if atheism is true, what best explains our moral beliefs? And I'm arguing that the adaptive Lincoln count, namely that we have these beliefs because they're survivally advantageous, is better than, say, a tracking count, namely that we have these beliefs because they are true. Or that natural selection
the point is if all you're doing is offering ad hoc explanations for why we have those beliefs, there's really no interest in that, right?
Well,
what I'm asking you is, if you want to make the case that there's a best explanation, right, for some phenomenon, you're going to have to give us more than that.
Well, I think there's pretty adequate evidence that natural selection does play a role in shaping our cognitive faculties. I think there's pretty good evidence.
What's the evidence for it?
What's the evidence for evolution?
No, what's the evidence that natural selection played an important role in shaping our cognitive faculties? Because natural selection is not the same thing as evolution, right?
Well, it's true. Natural selection is obviously very important.
So what I'm asking you is, right, because this is just going to come back to the same problem, right, is that for any claim about natural selection, right, having a role in explaining something, you're going to come up against the objection that I raised earlier, which is that unless you can deconfound a coextensive trait with the trait that you claim was deconfound it from a trait that you claim by hypothesis is the one that you take to conduce to survival, right? Unless you can find a way of deconfounding those two things and then testing them in the original evolutionary environment, I'm not seeing, right, how you can have independent evidence for your hypothesis.
Right, well,
so if you're going to say that there's a lot of evidence that natural selection played a role in shaping our cognitive faculties, you're going to have to be able to do that.
Okay.
And I'm not seeing how that's possible.
Well, although I'm not a biologist, I have some familiarity with evolution. And one of the traits of natural selection is that, you know, if some sort of thing harms our behavior, well, okay, let's consider a certain sample of the sort of judgments we make. I mean, the fact that something would promote one's survival is a reason in favor of it. So obviously,
that's not showing that in the case of a cognitive faculty, right? The reason why it's likely to be there was because it was adaptive, right?
All right,
That's just saying that we ought to expect, right, some mutations that might emerge, right, to be weeded out because they are detrimental to reproductive efficiency.
That's natural selection.
The fact that would not be sufficient to support the claim that you're making.
Well,
right?
begin to remind, you did interrupt me, so I didn't quite finish my
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so as I was mentioned, here's a sampling of the judgments we make about reasons for our behavior. The fact that something promotes our survival is a reason in favor of it. The fact that it would promote the interests of a family member, or, you know, an organism that is genetically similar to us, that's a reason to do it. We have greater obligations to help our children rather than our strangers. The fact that someone is treated one well is a reason to treat that person well in return. The fact that someone is altruistic is a reason to admire.
See, I'm not asking you for hypotheses. I was asking you for evidence, right? Your claim was that there's a lot of evidence that natural selection played a role in shaping our cognitive faculties. What you're doing is offering hypotheses.
No, I'm describing
as to how that would be the case.
Do you think that what I described are not judgments we humans make?
I don't see what difference it makes. It doesn't in any way show that natural selection played a role in shaping our cognitive faculties.
Okay, so how evidence works for a hypothesis is this. If it's more likely to expect this evidence if this hypothesis were true than if this hypothesis were false, then that serves as evidence for that hypothesis. And what I'm describing,
you're going to come up against the same problem, right? Which is that you're constructing just so stories.
Well,
so
that doesn't matter because that's how mathematics works. I can give you the theorem for this.
It doesn't matter mathematics doesn't have anything to do with it, right?
It doesn't have to do with evidence.
You're making a claim, right? That some hypothesis best explains some phenomenon, right? And I'm saying for it to explain that phenomenon and not be ad hoc, you have to have independent justification for it, right?
Okay.
And I've shown you how there's an intractable problem, right, when it comes to adaptive explanations in making claims of that kind, right? For any given adaptive explanation, you have to be able to deconfound that explanation hypothesis that some coextensive trait might be the one that contributed to its reproductive efficiency, right? And you don't have any way of doing that.
Yeah, Jack, isn't it pretty common among evolutionary biologists to think that altruism was a pretty significant role in natural selection? Like,
it is very common, right? The question is, are they justified in believing that, given the objection that I've raised? Right?
Which was that it's a just so story.
Exactly.
All right. So here's if we
do either of you actually think that this theory does anything? I mean, do we need to be talking about natural selection if neither of you actually?
It looks like Ochiwawa just came in, and he's a pretty sharp guy. How's it going, Ochi?
Hey.
No, I'm not seeing why Wade has to go through any of this, right?
I don't think
he has some argument.
Hold on, I want to hear from Ochi. He just jumped in, and I think he's got something to say.
Not really.
Sorry. I thought
I don't really agree with Jack's. So, like, Jack's saying that we can't understand if something's selective or not because there might be confounding factors, or I guess originally we don't know if there was originally if it was originally selective. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm saying that we don't have any way of deconfounding coextensive traits and testing to see which is the one which contributed to reproductive efficiency in the original evolutionary environment. And so therefore, all adaptive explanations, except ones that take place maybe in the recent past, are going to be just so stories.
Okay, so I don't think I need to meet your demands for it to qualify as evidence because, okay, if we can think of as evidence as something that raises the probability of a hypothesis, then if a certain evidence E, if that's
there's
more likely,
evidence for shoe stealing fairies, right?
Okay, if evidence E is more likely to be expected if the hypothesis were true than if the hypothesis were false, then it serves as evidence for that hypothesis, and that's the theorem of mathematics. Now we can dispute how much that evidence gives.
There's evidence for shoe stealing fairies, right?
I don't think there is. No.
So it's not the case that the existence of shoe stealing fairies doesn't raise the probability of shoes missing, shoes disappearing, right? Because that happens, right? People leave their shoes outside their bedrooms, and they wake up in the morning and they don't see their shoes there. Now, you're saying that's not evidence that shoe stealing fairies took them?
I think that's a little different. Like when we're talking about, I don't know if I'm still on topic, but if we're comparing that to like altruism in biology, are you comparing it to that?
What I'm saying is, I agree that evidence is what raises the probability of what it is evidence for.
Yeah.
And that evidence for a proposition is something that's expected, right? If that proposition is true.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that given that understanding of what evidence is, right, the shoe stealing fairy hypothesis is one that it's very easy to get evidence for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think there are different.
So I don't think it's particularly interesting that there can be some limited amount of evidence for some hypothesis if the hypothesis is merely ad hoc, right?
Yeah.
I think we're going to want something much stronger than that.
Yeah, so there are other things that separate like a just so story from an evidence proposition. Like there are different kinds of evidence, and we've already talked about predictive capabilities, like this idea of altruism.
Yeah, predictive novelty, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
You see, the point is that every ad hoc hypothesis is one which is evidentially supported, right? Every ad hoc hypothesis is one which is evidentially supported, right?
I mean, okay, so normally when I think of an ad hoc hypothesis, that there's no independent evidence for it, and there is independent evidence for natural selection. So all these judgments I've taken,
the claim was not that there was independent evidence for natural selection, right? The claim was that there's independent evidence that natural selection shaped our cognitive faculties.
Well, these moral judgments.
I'm not seeing that.
Well,
okay.
How do you establish that those moral judgments were
Exactly. Look what Ned just said in the sidebar. How about every communal species in existence? Like that's pretty much exactly what I was going toward. So when you have the evidence that altruism is a driving force, would be, like Jack said, every communal species in existence. Like when we cooperate together, it increases our survivability. That is a predictive capability.
Yeah, but the problem is it's entirely ad hoc, right?
No, I just gave you a predictive. Okay, Ned, are you there? What I'm saying is, right? If you observe communal behavior and you hypothesize that the reason why that communal behavior is there because it was adaptive, which is to say that in some ancestral population in which that trait emerged, right, it conferred enhanced reproductive efficiency on those members of the population that had it relative to those that didn't have it, right? When you make a claim like that, right, you have to be able to independently justify that is the best hypothesis, because there could be other traits that are coextensive with the trait of altruism, which are the ones that, in fact, move to reproductive efficiency, move to fixation because they contributed to reproductive efficiency. And the only way to test that would be to deconfound the two traits and have a trait competition among different members of the population with the two different traits, and seeing which trait won out. And you can't do that without a time machine, right? And so that's why these explanations are going to be ad hoc.
Well, so you're bringing up two things that we don't know. One is the original environment, and two is whether or not they're confounded. We can actually
there's an infinity.
confound them.
There's an infinity. Every trait has an infinity of coextensive traits. Right?
Are you sure about that?
Yeah. Every trait has an infinity of coextensive traits. So that's going to be a big problem.
Not when you look at it from the perspective of when you have an inherent trait to every communal species that seems to run.
That's
Wait, let me finish, Jack. I mean, okay. I mean, let me finish, man.
I second that. Yeah.
Thank you. When we look at everything from bees all the way to mammals, all the way up to us, if you want to include us in that group, and the more dependent a species is on the reproduction of a single individual or a low number count individual, namely bees, there's only one, at least in each hive at a given time, at certain times, that can reproduce, namely the queen. And when those bees are threatened, that entire collective organism, if the way that I view it, will sacrifice themselves to protect that one individual. Every one of them will sacrifice their lives to protect that one individual. Now, then we start to extrapolate out and say, okay, how many in let's say we do a graduated type a look at altruism and what we would consider to be moral behavior. The more of the species that benefits from diversity in that gene pool, the more we see it start to reflect an overarching quote-unquote moral behavior that's happening throughout each one of those species. The one trait that seems to stay constant is that morality, that ability to self-sacrifice, show altruism throughout, regardless of, you want to talk from an insect all the way up to a human, that seems to be a collective trait, i.e. advantage to allowing that organism to exist. So
again, I'm asking you how you would independently test the claim.
Well, when we look at organisms that don't, if we take out, and let's say that we look at microbes and we look at bacteria that have a huge reproductive advantage over basically anything else, and we look at how some of those work more collectively than others, which ones tend to take over, the petri dish or the food source? The ones that tend to act cooperatively and do not undercut those of their same species tend to take over, whereas the ones that act more, let's say, independent and don't act in altruistic fashions, they tend to be, let's say, overtaken by the species that does.
Well, that doesn't seem to me to require a genetic explanation.
Yeah, guys, we're getting a lot of complaints from the audience that we're kind of losing them. We're veering too far off topic.
Yeah, I think this is all a detour. I think all Wade has to do is try to explain how his argument is supposed to work, right? Is he trying to make some kind of abductive argument or not?
Jack.
That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, Jack, I'd like to get some interaction with it from Ned, since you've had the floor for a while. I wonder if we could shift it over to, and that's not to say that you can't talk, but I wonder if we can get some objections from Ned.
All right, well, I mean, what I came into was P2 of your argument, Maverick, was what I kind of had issues with. So if we can back up and you can kind of go through P2 again to make sure that I'm not miscoloring you, because after all this other sidebar stuff, I may be off topic at this point. So if you could go back to P2 or just go P1, P2, that's kind of all we need to go to there.
All right. So premise 1 is, if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. Premise 2, moral knowledge does exist. For example, we are warranted in believing that torturing infants just for fun is morally wrong. Conclusion, therefore God exists.
Okay, so P2, what I'd like to know is that, to me, I don't see how we have it almost seems like you've got an objective moral set of standards that we all agree on. And that strikes. I mean,
we don't need a whole set though. We only need one.
Okay, and that's great. That's even better. So let's boil it down to one. Is there one?
I like Wade's example. It's wrong to torture babies for fun.
And how do you get there? How do you know that in every case, all cases, that is always wrong?
It's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun.
Again, okay. I mean, I can set up these kind of extreme scenarios where if that were the case, allowing someone to do that or having someone do that, if it results, depending on what your goals are, if it results in the furtherment of your goal, that would make it a good. That would make it, I mean, I can go back to the argument that I used for the nope argument that I discussed with Hovind. I mean, here's the thing. I'll put a little thought experiment out there.
Well, why is that wrong? Did he explain why it's wrong?
Well, that's again. I mean, it just seems like to me that you're just demanding that it's wrong, and almost it's I don't know, axiomatic in this point where I'm not going to accept it. It's just an axiomatic fact that torturing babies is wrong.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you don't think that there's something wrong with torturing infants just for fun, we'll agree to disagree.
Well, wait a second, Maverick. That's not what I said. I'm not saying that I don't agree with that. My morals also guide me in that same direction. But that is a huge gulf to say just because both of us agree on the same goal, that goal somehow becomes objective.
Well, no, that's not the argument. The argument didn't claim that morality was objective.
Okay. If you don't have, okay, so again.
Could you go through the argument again, please?
Okay, so premise 1, if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. Premise 2, moral knowledge does exist. For example, we know that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun. Conclusion, therefore God exists.
Okay, so if you're saying that part of knowledge, that knowledge, quote unquote, that moral knowledge, there is a black or white, there is a yes or no to the answer of is torturing kids wrong? I'm saying that it's a gray area and it's a graduated scale, just like every moral decision. So
how do you know that it's morally wrong to torture babies just for fun?
Well, because I can come up with scenarios where it would be the absolute optimal.
I was asking.
Wait, where it would be the absolute what, Ned?
It would be the moral. It would be a moral ought instead of a moral.
Right, because of a consequentialist philosophy that torturing this baby will lead to some greater end. Is that what you mean?
He's saying that we have moral knowledge of this. How does he know it? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I want to finish this with Ned though, and then we can
finish your tangent. And then
you can go on that one, but you can also make it just a moral. I mean, if again going down no, we know that if God is omnibenevolent, omnipresent, I mean just omni-God in general, I'm not going to go through all the omnis, God allows people to torture babies for fun, and God's plan includes that. We have to come to the conclusion.
No.
Okay, then again, you have to get around that, because if we have got a God that knows that this is occurring, has the power to stop it, and chooses not to, not only chooses not to, but chooses to put a plan in place that requires this to happen, and that plan ends up in the optimal good. Okay, then get there for me, because that's what I'm saying is you can't. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, the first thing about the consequentialist thing, you said you could still use that, but I don't think you could, because a qualifier of this, I think specifically to disallow that would be, you're torturing babies for fun, not for some greater good. So
no. Yeah. Just the personal motivation does not speak to the reason that it's put in place to begin with.
So you're talking about like a divine plan, not like the person doing
Absolutely, yes. I'm talking about the divine plan. I'm talking about the perfect plan.
Okay, yeah, I get what you're saying. You and I kind of went back and forth on this before. The whole God's divine plan makes everything moral good, and I don't think that's a very convincing argument, because, like I told you, there are different levels to some event. There's a sense in which one event can be good in the sense that it is part of the unfolding of a divine plan, and yet evil because the person who's doing it is evil. So there can be more than one aspect.
But again, what you're doing there is you're basically avoiding the problem that unless you disagree with this, in that God created even the evil people and gave them a role to play in his divine plan. If he did that, and that I'm assuming that he's optimal in everything he does, that would you would have, I mean, I don't see how you could get away from inferring that if that's part of his divine will and part of his divine plan, and he works in an optimal fashion, that evil has to become good, because that's the only way he could have done it to bring about the ultimate good. Yeah,
and yet the evil people that he created and implemented in his plan are still evil. They're still doing something that's wrong.
From our perspective, not from an objective perspective.
No, from a truly objective, like there's more than one true.
How could it be? How could it be wrong from God's perspective?
Exactly.
There's okay. Look, there's more than one. There's more than one way that God could look at an event. There's like it's not, God isn't restricted to only looking at it as it relates to the unfolding of the divine plan. He can look at it as it relates to the value of a human being.
Okay, but again, is everything that God is using for his own glory and his own, to bring about the plan that he is in practice?
As I said, yes, I think that's the case, but I also think that he can look at it from the perspective of the value of a human being. He recognizes that human beings have value, and so an event can be both good in one sense and evil in another sense.
Not in the objective sense.
Yeah, both of those would be objective in different ways.
I don't understand. It's better, right, that it happened, that the evil act didn't happen. It's better that the evil act occurred than that it didn't occur, right?
In some sense.
So that seems to make the notion of evil meaningless, right?
No, exactly my point of no.
I mean, why? What sense are you saying anything? It's not about it.
Sorry, you're
when
breaking
in fact,
up. You're breaking up.
Is it still breaking up?
Not then, but
okay. In what sense is evil not actually a vacuous notion, right? When in fact, evil is optimal, right?
Yeah.
Because the non-evil action, right, is not actually optimal. So I don't understand what you're saying when you say that's better, right, than the evil action.
Well, let's try it that way, Jack. Okay, Richard, let's say that we did this. Let's say that we benefited the individual. The individual didn't, let's say the baby didn't get tortured for the pleasure of someone else, okay? But it lessened God's plan. God's plan did not end as optimally as it could have. It wasn't as good as it could have been. So is that evil act that was, let's say, thwarted because of however, now does that good act of saving that child now become an evil act, or is, I mean, we're not.
It would have to. It'd have to be an evil act.
The way that is
phrased, it would have to be an evil act because it would actually not conduce to the greatest good, right?
Which I agree, Jack, but I don't want to hear.
Yeah, I mean that's only the case if you adhere to some sort of consequentialist philosophy where the ends have to justify the means.
That's exactly. Wait a minute. Wait a second, Jack. That's exactly what the Bible tells us. Is it not? Is not God's will and God's plan? Is not all of this toward basically a large means to an end?
I guess I'm not understanding what justifies God's permitting it if it's not because it contributes to a greater good.
Okay. Well, one idea is that, consider, for example, you have an injury on your foot. And the only way that one can eliminate is like, well, I can't get rid of this sore that you're feeling right now, sort of chopping off your whole foot. And then the idea is that by preventing the evil, you'd actually bring about a worse evil. For example, you'd say, well, it's bad.
Right. So therefore it actually optimizes it.
It's still bad. It's still something that ought not to be the case, all other things being equal. That doesn't mean
wait
it's
a minute.
good or
But there,
anything like
but
that. It's still bad.
but that's the problem, Maverick. That's the problem. Is it not all things are not all equal? We're talking about we're talking about an omni being. There is no all things equal. There is either the best of all possible situations or there's not.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going way off topic here.
Well, no, we're not, because this goes back to P2. Because you're assuming at P2 you have made the claim that we know we can have knowledge of this quote unquote moral knowledge, whatever that means. If there's no such thing as a moral knowledge, if we can determine that any action that takes place is not moral or immoral, it is all moral because it's toward God's.
Actually, no,
plan.
I think it challenges P1.
And
I mean, because premise 2 doesn't even say that God exists.
Well, unless you believe that God exists in the real world, then you're challenging premise 1.
No, what I'm saying is you cannot have knowledge. There is no such thing as moral knowledge because there's no such thing as moral. If you're going to premise this with the existence of an omni-God, again, I'm going to grant that. With the existence of an omni-God, there's no such thing as moral knowledge because morality means nothing.
Yeah,
it's meaningless.
Okay, you could deny. Okay, so premise 2, again, to reiterate, is that there is moral knowledge. For example, we know that there is something morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun. So by denying this premise, you would have to deny that we know it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun. Are you prepared to accept that consequence?
Yeah, we know that. You haven't shown why we know that.
That's exactly where I was going. Is that to make that objective statement that torturing babies just for fun is objectively wrong in every circumstance.
That's not what the premise says.
Okay, then explain to me when you say such as we know, I'll paraphrase, such as we know torturing children just for fun is wrong or is immoral. That would imply, I mean, are you saying that it's not always wrong or is it always wrong?
Well, we can put it this way. We know that there are some cases, we can conceive of a case where it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun.
Right, and we can also conceive of certain circumstances where that same action would be a moral good. In fact, the ultimate of all moral goods.
Which is irrelevant to the second premise.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Ned. The argument itself does not presuppose that an omni-God exists.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying. Okay.
Well, let's suppose that you're arguing with an atheist because premise 2 is a theologically neutral premise.
How does he know that torturing babies for fun is immoral?
Exactly, Joe. That's what I'm asking.
Okay, I think that is a good place to go, Joe. But right. I don't think but Ned, like I said, I think your objection is an objection to P1.
Okay, well, if you want to go P1, I don't care. But I still want to do what Joe was saying. And how do you justify that statement on P2?
Okay, so how do we know that? How do we know that something is morally wrong with torturing infants just for fun? Well, sort of the same way that we sort of know that the external world is real. We believe it on the basis of intuition in practice.
So not everybody believes it.
Now you could say that I don't have that intuition.
Hold on. Go ahead, Jack. Go ahead.
Well, it's just I mean that's only going to work for people who share your intuition, right?
That's true.
You're running into the same issue. Other people have other intuitions.
That's true, but here's where the justification comes in. You'd have to show, okay, what does that imply? That we don't have any moral knowledge at all.
Exactly.
Okay, so you would have to accept, for example, that we don't know that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun in any circumstance. That we don't know that to be true.
Fine.
And we don't.
All right, then that would be what you'd have to accept. But it seems that most people would share that intuition that we know that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun.
Not only maybe even in this room our collective intuition, but if we get a sociopath in here, we get someone here who quote thinks differently than us or has different goals than we do, that person can, I guarantee you, justify that.
Well, it's not just sociopaths, right? It's going to be it is true in the sense that they're going to be able to justify it by appeal to intuitions. But But you don't need to get a sociopath, right? You could just get an error theorist or a moral relativist, right?
Exactly,
Well,
you're right.
well,
Wouldn't
even
be a
more
very
relativists
interesting
believe
argument.
that morality exists.
Yeah, I believe that moral properties exist, but I don't think that there's a correct or right way to perceive them, right? So it wouldn't
You
be
don't
an
think there are
interesting
moral truths?
argument. I'm sorry?
You don't think that there are moral truths?
No.
Objective?
No,
no,
I think
didn't
they're
say
relative.
objective. Again, nowhere
Yeah,
in the argument
all
does
relative.
morality is objective.
I think there are moral properties, right? But they can be perceived differently, and there isn't a right or wrong way by which to perceive them.
Well, the only
sounds like an error
the
theory.
qualifier the qualifier.
Well, it's an error theory with respect to categoricity, but it's not an error theory with respect to the existence of non-natural value properties.
And the qualifier you have to tag to all this is your overarching goal. Because the only reason that we think we ought to do something other than something else is based on our overall goals. In other words, if you're playing on one sports team, I'm playing on the team that you're playing against, I ought to try and score or do whatever the objective of the game is to win the game because I'm on that team. If next season I switch to your team, then I should defend the team that I was against and work exactly opposite because my goals have changed. So if you want to try to talk about the correct action, first you have to lay down what your goals are and how those goals are either objective or those goals are synonymous with every person on the planet.
It doesn't sound like you might be. It sounds like you might be moral nihilist with respect to the morality I described earlier when this began.
I don't know if I'd go as far as nihilism, but I definitely would go to the point where it would be okay. Go ahead.
Remember how you find
I'm sorry.
morality. Morality. Okay, so there's two different types of ought. One type of ought is what we call descriptive. An example is hypothetical oughts of hypothetical imperatives. Like if you want to do well in school, you ought to study. Just means something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to do well. You need to study to do well in school. So that type of ought is descriptive. But the type of morality I'm talking about doesn't use that type of ought. It's prescriptive. It prescribes, and it's not purely descriptive. So the type of ought you described is apparently a descriptive ought. More specifically, what's called in philosophy a hypothetical ought. Like if you want to do X, you ought to do Y. Describing
hypothetical oughts are still prescriptive, though, right? They still tell you.
No, not by the definitions. Stipulative definitions I was giving.
I guess by your definition. But I think there's a couple easy ways to clear this up, right? You can just ask, regardless of whether relativism is true, can't you just ask, are there true moral statements, right? So that's the first interesting split. Can it be true, or is it true that some moral judgment is either true or false, right? Now, I'm sorry, the gentleman with the brain.
Ned.
Sounds like Ned. Sorry. It sounds like you're saying the answer is yes. Moral judgments can be true or false, right? And presumably your position is that it's possibly to know it, right? So now you're a moral cognitive, or maybe not, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is, I mean, I don't think I have, and I'll put it this way to try to clear it up as much as possible. I have never been presented with a moral dilemma or a moral ought, anything that, even torturing babies, I cannot come up with a scenario where that changes from a bad action or a immoral to a moral. I mean, there's plenty of ways that we can describe, if nothing else, from consequentialism, how we can get to why we should do the opposite of what our intuition would tell us. So I don't know if there is any, at least from an absolutist standpoint, anything like that. So
yeah, hey, we've got someone new in here. Ned, you know him. Hey, Zach.
Did you remove Michael? So
yeah, I made room for him.
Hey, Saka.
Yeah, I wanted to make room.
Okay.
Yeah, he wasn't saying anything anyway, so sorry. Hey, Zach.
So do we know or not that torturing babies for fun is immoral?
I think we do.
Answer that?
I think we do.
But not everybody agrees.
Well, the reason why you gave was
well, no, I don't know. I don't know about that. I think in some context, intuition can be a good argument. Like, let me give you an example.
But not in this one. So you need
hold
to
on,
give
hold on. Okay, well, don't interrupt me.
Okay, so you go on this tangent. Let me know when you're done with the tangent.
Or I could just remove you.
No, I don't do that.
Okay. So what I was saying is that in some contexts, okay, I'm hearing an echo. Yeah, in some contexts, intuitions can be a good justification for our beliefs, and we agreed, like for example, with personal beliefs, that would be the case. But then I think by extension, it could also be when we share intuitions with other people. Like if I can appeal to somebody else's grasp of the moral realm and say, "Don't you think that that is wrong?" So in that case,
well, there's different moral communities, right? I mean, there's communities of sociopaths, right, and there's communities of Nazis.
I wouldn't say that to a sociopath though, and I wouldn't say
it just seems to me. It just seems to me that the argument appealing to that is going to be inert again. Against some other community.
Against them it would, but with somebody who shares the intuition that it's wrong to torture babies for fun, then you're basically saying, don't you already believe this? That's why.
Well, that doesn't seem like a justification, though.
No, but it is kind of showing that you already grasp this truth.
No,
it just means two people have the same opinion.
Yeah.
Right. Would you say that the Heaven's Gate cult and their intuition that there was a spaceship on Halley's Comet that was going to take their souls up?
That's not my point, because that's not a shared intuition. I'm not using.
It wasn't.
I think another example might be.
But what it sounds like
hold on. Let Sombrero Man go.
Oh. I think another example may be more helpful. What Richard is trying to say here is that our justification or the fact that it's rational to believe in the existence of a moral realm is probably somewhat equivalent to believing in the reality of the external world. Now, any argument that you give in favor of there being an external world is going to be less obvious than the mere just appearance and intuition that it's there. So if I were to try to give an argument for you that there is a world outside of my brain, any argument that I give is going to be based on premises that are less obvious than, well, don't you see it too? And that's kind of what Richard is getting at here, is that Richard is saying, don't you also apprehend a realm of objective moral values and duties, just like you apprehend the external world? That's kind of what he's getting at. And of course, you can always find communities of people. Please let me finish. Please let me finish. You can always find communities of people that will belligerently say, no, I can't know anything outside of my own head. For all I know, I'm in the Matrix. For all I know, it's all a simulation outside of my head. And the only arguments that you give are going to be less obvious and are based on things that are less obvious than the mere appearance of things. So that's what he's saying. It's not a justification. It's what's called a properly basic belief. It's not.
Wait a minute. What's the criterion for the propriety rather than the mere basicality of the belief?
And
I'm not sure what you're getting at.
And that's why
I understand what a basic. Sorry, go ahead.
Hold on, let me interject real quick. So just a couple things. So the difference here is that belief in the external world being properly basic isn't structured at all like I am directly apprehending a world of abstract moral truths or non-physical moral truths, right? What we have for evidence is something like we have a strong repulsion to the idea of torturing a child for fun. And that can be explained under multiple theories, right? And not only that, but there are lots of very competent, non-crazy philosophers who hold to error theory, to hold to expressivism. And we don't typically extend that to philosophers who deny the external world. And then finally, Plantinga himself says that belief in God itself isn't a properly basic belief, right? It's something more specific, like I know there's a God and that he loves, or I know that God loves me, right? And from that, it's trivial to deduce that God exists, right? Because it's entailed by God loving you. But having a strong repulsion to torturing children for fun doesn't entail, at least unless you have an argument, that there is an abstract realm of moral properties, right? It's still compatible on the face of it with expressivism or moral error theory. All of those have explanations of why we feel a particular moral judgment.
But the justification isn't that it's repulsive to me, is that it just seems to be the sort of thing that people ought not to do. Now, it is true that not everybody shares the same intuitions. And so for people who don't share the intuition that there's something wrong with torturing us just for fun, I mean, there's nothing you can do with that sort of people. But I think the argument would be a good one for those who do share the intuition that we know it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun.
Well, but I'm saying that what is being explained is actually different. You're saying what we're trying to, everybody shares the intuition that there's this moral proposition that is true, which is it's wrong. It is true that it is wrong to torture children for fun, right? And I'm saying it seems to be that the data we're trying to explain is something like when somebody says it is permissible to torture children for fun, we have strong revulsion to it. And that has multiple different explanations on the face of it. Now, lots of philosophers have gone on to show how somehow you can construct an argument for moral objectivism from that feeling, right? But unless you have something like that, there's no direct connection between what we'll call the intuition that it's wrong to torture babies for fun. There's no direct connection between that and us having like moral knowledge, right? It could be something else. It could be an expressivist sort of solution, or it could be an error theorist solution.
Well, if atheism is true, I do think the error theorist solution is the correct solution.
Okay, but that's but we're not worried about that. I don't think, right? What we're trying to do is create a connection between us having some kind of like intuition or some kind of strong feeling or seeming about torturing children for fun, and you're trying to connect that to objectivism. And I'm saying
no, that's not quite true. So all I'm doing is, all premise 2 says is that we have moral knowledge. There are some moral propositions that we know to be true. For example, we know it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun. Now, again, not everyone will agree with that. I can see that.
Okay,
but I'm saying that there's a problem with. I'm saying that not everybody, and I'm not talking about fringe cases like people who deny the existence of the external world. I'm saying that the pre-theoretic seeming, that intuition, is much more basic, and it can't just be. You can't just say it's expressed in a proposition that can be true or false. It could be just revulsion, and so there is no moral knowledge, even though, so we can keep the intuition and we can ditch moral knowledge. Nobody has the intuition that there are abstract moral facts. People seem to have a pre-theoretic seeming that I feel very terribly when I think of a child being tortured for fun or something like that. That seems to be the data we're trying to explain. And you're saying that's a case of moral knowledge, but moral knowledge expresses beliefs, and not all people who accept that intuition think that that judgment or that proposition is expressing a belief. It's expressing something else, right? So you can still be, say, an expressivist.
Right, and even if you do take a cognitivist interpretation, right, that's not going to deliver anything with respect to the ontology of the properties. So error theory or relativism will still be a live option.
Right. So I'm saying there's a long train.
Yeah, let's let
intuition and
well, all this seems to be beside the point, though.
Hold on, I have a quick question.
Man.
I'm not understanding something. I didn't catch your clarification there between you were saying that there's a difference between fringe cases of people that denying the external world, and then there are mainstream philosophers who deny the object or the objective moral realm, I suppose. But I didn't quite understand your argument for why those are not quite equivalent. Because it seems to me that you could run the same argument and say that for the external world case and just say that we're not actually trying to explain the external world. All you actually have are certain qualia, I guess you could say, that need to be explained. And the reality of an external world is something that is an explanation for those qualia. But there actually isn't a single proposition that's being expressed to you such that the external world is real.
So the idea behind properly basic beliefs. Oh, sorry, if you weren't done, continue.
Well, I was just going to terminate. If you clarify what the difference is there, because it seems to me like there's not much of a difference.
So here's the reason why I'm bringing this up and then I'll tell you why I think it's different. And I think Plantinga would agree with me about properly basic beliefs, which maybe we don't care about, but let me just give it anyway. So we were saying that the support for premise 2, that we have moral knowledge, is that we have an intuition that we have moral knowledge, right? Moral knowledge depends on a very particular way of parsing metaethics. One, that moral judgments express propositions that can be true or false, right? There are long traditions of metaethicists who say that moral judgments do not express propositions that can be true or false. They're rather something like preferences, okay? So just keep that split in mind, okay? Now, the support that we have moral knowledge, aka that moral judgments express propositions that can be true or false, is supposed to be from intuition, right? So there's supposed to be a direct link between intuition and moral knowledge, right? Such that if I have the intuition, that's support for the existence of moral knowledge. But I'm suggesting there's a split there, that we can have, that the kind of things that we get from intuition aren't moral propositions that can be true or false necessarily. There's something else, like a strong feeling of disgust, right? But a strong feeling of disgust isn't moral knowledge, because that's not a moral belief, right? And without beliefs, you can't have knowledge. And the reason that I brought Plantinga into this in the external world is because even Plantinga thinks that properly basic beliefs are something very specific, and they're not necessarily philosophical in nature, or at least they don't necessarily prove a particular philosophical theory. So take the idea that God exists as properly basic. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that Plantinga does not think that belief in God is properly basic. He thinks that there are other propositions that entail the existence of God are properly basic, such that God loves me and he has a plan for my life. That's properly basic. That entails the existence of God. However, having a strong feeling of disgust doesn't entail moral knowledge. You could still be a moral expressivist, which denies the existence of moral knowledge. Does that make sense?
Right. Right. I understood that part. But what I'm saying is that it seems like you can still run the same argument and just replace feelings of disgust with certain qualia that you interpret to be your experience with the external world. That was where I was confused.
Well, if you can draw, so if you guys have experiences of abstract moral properties, that would be very odd, right? At least I don't have that at all. When somebody says torturing babies for fun is morally permissible, right? I don't say, all right, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to intuit whether or not there's a moral property that checks out here. I have something else, which is a feeling or something like that, or an emotion, right? So at least for me, yeah, I have some kind of like intuitive punch when somebody says something like that, but it's more like disgust. It's nothing like I'm intuiting some abstract moral property. And maybe you guys are just built differently, but that's certainly not what I feel.
Well, I do feel like a sort of disgust. There's also
well, hold on. You still haven't answered my question. Here's what my question is. You said that it's not the same thing as the external world, but my specific question is, why can you not take that exact same argument that you made? Your argument, as I understand it, is we don't intuit moral propositions. We intuit feelings of disgust that we then infer may be moral propositions or may not be. I'm saying you can run that exact same argument and have skepticism for the external world. We don't interpret propositions about the external world. We experience certain qualia that we then intuit must have some propositions about something that we're experiencing, which may or may not be the external world. But it could be, in fact, the case that what we experience as qualia are, in fact, non-propositional things as well, just like feelings of disgust. So it seems to me that the argument that you're saying that leads that we should be skeptical about intuiting moral propositions, we can also run to say that we should be skeptical about intuiting certain propositions about the world.
But I
Does that
think
make sense?
for his argument is saying that a better way to understand these intuitions is expressivistically.
It's
Right.
at least compatible with expressivism. It's
Yes,
compatible
yes.
with all of them.
But what?
I mean,
but I don't think you're suggesting, right, that we should be expressivists about the external world, right?
Correct. I'm saying that intuition doesn't get us to moral knowledge. So when you said the justification for a belief in moral knowledge is intuition, I don't see that that holds, because properly basic beliefs are something that entail a particular philosophical theory, right? So the existence of God is entailed by us having this properly basic belief about God loving us and having a plan for our life. The existence of the external world is entailed by us having an experience of one hand and then another, or something like that, right? So that, for at least for Plantinga, right? That's what properly basic beliefs are. Now, if you guys are having intuitions, like if your intuitions aren't something like feelings, right? But instead are something like, I'm intuiting that I'm reaching out into the realm of abstracta or non-physical objects and grasping, non-physical properties, then fine. But that's not what's happening right in my brain. That's not what's happening with me. So I'm not even understanding your support for premise 2, right? I'd at least want to hear an argument for why your pre-theoretic seeming is incompatible with something like expressivism.
Oh, I didn't know who you were talking to.
Everybody.
Sombrero Man, you still there?
Zachary? All right.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I understand your argument. I still don't understand why you're making an exception for qualia about the external world. I mean, you use the example of experiencing one hand for the other, but
twice.
It's been it's been explained, man. Come on.
No,
I didn't see
no,
this
you're not.
either.
You're not listening to me.
Could you see
I
the
understand.
side chat too?
I understand the argument that you're making, that the experience of disgust is consistent both with moral objectivism, moral realism, as well as moral expressivism, and even earlier when you were saying error theory as well. But why? But my specific question was, why are you exempting qualia from that? Why are you exempting qualia about the external world? That's what I am specifically focused on. I completely understand what you're saying about moral knowledge. I understand that part.
Okay, well then, for the sake of the argument, unless we want to talk about qualia, if you understand my point about morality, let's just skip that. Right?
What?
If you
I guess you haven't answered your question.
No. Okay. So I understand what you're saying about that, but what I'm saying is that I'm saying that style of argument seems to me to argue for more things than you want it to argue for. Like, what I'm saying is that it seems to be justifying this other thing over here. It seems to be justifying skepticism about the external world. Look, I'm asking a genuine question here, because I understand the moral knowledge thing, but it seems to me that moral disgust and qualia are kind of the same type of experience. And so if you're inferring skepticism about moral disgust, I'm just curious why you're not inferring skepticism about, the external world experiences. That's the question I'm asking.
Because, Jack, we're talking about his argument on morality. We're not, I mean, if we want to go into solipsism, that's another discussion. But
Right,
what
so
I'm saying is that's almost too cold quay here.
No, it's not.
I'm willing to drop it. I'm willing to drop my belief in the external world for the sake of this argument, right?
Okay, all right.
Because it sounds like you understand that there's a gap between theoretic seemings of whatever's happening when somebody tells us that torturing children for fun is morally permissible, and moral knowledge. As long as we understand that gap, I guess I don't really care what happens to the external world.
But that does seem like a problem, JHC, because it doesn't seem like you would want the price of your objection to be that you lost a good response to external world skeptics.
Well, I don't have a good response to external. As you know, Jack, I don't think that there is a good argument against external world skeptics.
So then you aren't losing anything.
Oh,
Exactly.
okay. Well, I'm sorry. Well, I didn't know that. Yeah. Well, if that's the case, if you don't think there's a good argument against external world skeptics, then I can totally understand why you would also think that there's not a good argument against moral skeptics.
Well, if somebody tells me that looking at my hands entails that there's an external world, I don't think that any dyed-in-wool epistemic skeptic is going to accept that. I'm not saying I'm a skeptic, right? I'm just saying I don't think that it's an argument against skepticism. I think that you're more.
Well, he even conceded that, right? He said that it's not actually a justification. It's just a basic belief.
Sure, he said that, but what I'm wondering, because the only thing that we've heard about premise 2 so far is that we all have an intuition about it, and that there's something unreasonable going on, like those people don't have the same intuition who reject premise 2. But I'm saying it's very easy to imagine that somebody denies premise 2 and has the exact same intuition that I assume you guys are all having.
Which would
so
be
it's
me.
not evidence.
Yeah, I don't think that the intuition of revulsion at torturing babies is in some way a justifier for the belief that there are moral facts.
That's not the justification I'm using, though.
Sorry, for the belief that moral facts. Oh, it wasn't that.
No.
What is the justifier then?
The intuition.
I thought you said it was intuitive.
Yeah, but it's not the revulsion that justifies it. It's just that it seems to me that there's something morally wrong with torturing innocent sentient life just for fun. It's not the revulsion. It's not that emotional revulsion. It's that it seems.
That's how I would define revulsion. Why are you not calling
Well,
it?
I think what he's saying is,
if you define revulsion like that, then you wouldn't agree with Jack, who's trying to separate that moral fact from the revulsion.
But it just sounds like all Wade is really saying is that my justification for premise 2 is that it seems to be true, right? Which doesn't seem interesting.
And also, it's almost argument ad populum, because we know that there are people that wouldn't agree with that.
Yeah,
and he's already brought that up. He says it's like, well, yeah, most people would agree with me, and the ones that don't are just wrong.
Exactly.
I mean, that seems to be the basis of how he's trying to justify it.
No, that's not my basis. I was just pointing out that this argument
because we pointed out that people might not agree with you on
No.
this.
Okay, so you guys are misunderstanding the argument. It's not all of these people agree and everyone in the room agrees, it's therefore true. We're appealing to the fact that everybody agrees that it's true.
Everybody doesn't agree.
Yeah, you've agreed to that.
Okay,
so in which
case, who cares?
No, so to a sociopath, it wouldn't.
Why do they have to be a sociopath? See, there you.
It doesn't have to be a sociopath.
Okay. I did not say that it had to be a sociopath.
Well, that's what you're implying. You're implying
No,
that
I'm not.
When you make the argument, you're saying that anybody that doesn't agree with you, therefore, has to be a sociopath.
I did not say that. I did not say that. I understand that there are moral nihilists who are not sociopaths, but
they don't have to even be nihilists, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So far, premise 2 seems to be radically undetermined by any of the evidence so far, right?
Yeah, and that's why I think that's probably the premise that I would focus on if we had a debate. I'll put it that way.
What about moral facts that don't seem intuitive? What about those? How do you come to know those?
Yeah, that was actually why I chose the example of torturing infants for fun, because there are legitimately moral dilemmas, and sometimes we can't, or sometimes it's more difficult to come to a moral conclusion. So, but the thing is, as long as you can find one moral fact, then the argument would work. So it wouldn't really matter that there are moral facts that are more difficult to come to.
Wait, sorry. Go back to that. You said just if you can find one moral fact, then your argument's validated.
Well, okay. Well, the way Wade is using this is calling it moral facts rather than objectivity. That's not usually how I run the argument. So when I think about this, I talk about it in terms of objective moral values. So if we can find at least one, then that would prove that there is.
Well, no. Because from the same viewpoint, I can I can present some type of moral dilemma where the population is split 50-50, and from your same basis, be like, there we have proof of relativism.
What do you mean?
Well, because if it all it takes is for you to point to one fact because the fact that everybody agrees on something could be a happy coincidence. It doesn't matter.
Yeah,
it doesn't actually lend to your point. Because I can use the same type of argument and say, listen, here's one fact in which the population is split 50-50, and therefore that's all I need to do to validate that relativism is true.
Yeah, except I'm not appealing to the population to make the argument. I just explained that.
Well,
can I step in and
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how.
All that would prove is if you could run an argument like that where the population is split and it justified relativism, all that would show is that objectivism is true and relativism are true. Objectivism is true with respect to this one property, and relativism is true with the rest.
Yeah,
so
like if you were actually,
I'm saying it's not a good.
I mean, I agree. The way that you're representing the argument is not a good argument. Just saying the population agrees, therefore it's true, that's not a good way to run the argument, and that's why I didn't do it like that. And I mean, I just explained the way that I did it, though. So,
well, what I'd like to know is, do you have an example of one?
We've been talking about torturing babies for fun. Again,
I don't. Show me. I mean, I can give you cases where that would not be the moral. I mean, an immoral action.
Okay, but that's not okay. Here's the claim. We know there is at least one moral truth that we know to be true.
That's
what premise 2 claims.
Which is we still haven't established that.
Okay, but the thing. Okay, here's the thing that even if you can show cases where torturing babies for fun would be a moral good. Even if you could show that it were objectively wrong in one case, then you still have an objective standard of right and wrong.
You don't have to show that it's good.
All I have to show is that it's not.
No. There is a difference between. I would say that there's a difference between absolute and objective morality. Absolute morality would mean an ethic that's absolute in every case. Like, for example, you would say that lying is wrong every single time you do it. But an objective ethic would be to say that lying is generally wrong, but there are some situations in which it would be acceptable. Like, for example, if you're hiding a persecuted minority in your attic, and the government comes and says, "Are those people there?" and you say, "No, they're not there." Then you're lying, but you're doing the right thing. So that's a distinction between objective and absolute.
Okay.
How about this? It's morally wrong to torture an infant just for fun, just for torture's sake, and does not accomplish any other greater good. Just torture.
How do you know that?
Exactly. And wait a second.
I wouldn't accept it.
Yeah, I was going to say there would be no way to delineate that and to make sure that all of those conditions are met. I mean
that might be true, but that doesn't show that what I just stated is an example of something that's morally wrong. Now,
and if unicorns exist, then unicorns exist. But again, that's a meaningless statement at that point.
Well, I wouldn't say it's meaningless. I understand it.
Well,
okay, but back to my question. There are going to be people who do not accept premise 2, that even when you give examples, like there's something we know that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun. And even when you give an example like that, there are going to be some people like, no, I don't buy it. I don't think we do know any moral truths, not even that one, that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun. But the argument just wouldn't work for those people.
Look, all you're saying is that my argument will work for people who think my argument will work. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Well, no.
Way to go.
Hold on. I get what Wade is saying. Because if you're talking to somebody who isn't into the theology stuff and isn't into debating the existence of God, doesn't know anything about the moral argument, if you said something to them like, "Do you think it's wrong to torture babies for fun?" They would. I mean, they'd probably say yes. But once you get into this argument and you think about the theological implications and you hear the theist presentation, then you might start to subconsciously look for ways around the argument and say, well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe so I think that might be what Wade is getting at. Wade, is that about right?
Yeah, more or less. So generally a good argument that's not question begging is that are there people who don't already accept the conclusion but accept that the premise is true? And that is certainly the case for premise 2. There are a lot of people who think that we do know that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun, but don't accept that God exists, for example. And for those sort of people, the argument might be useful.
Okay, but that would be the same thing as me saying I've got a 5-year-old that I've taught that 5 times 5 is 20, and because that person believes that, now that makes my argument that 5 times 5 is 20 useful to that person. It doesn't make it true. And that's what I'm saying is, if you want to get to what is real and what is true, then we need to vet each premise to see if that premise holds. And I'm not seeing 2 hold.
I don't think that 5 times 5 equals 20 is on par with we know it's wrong to torture infants just for fun.
It would be to the 5-year-old, but I talked 5 times 5 is 20, because to him, without understanding mathematics at all, without understanding what the function of multiplication does, he is going to know nothing other than when he is given this stimulus, 5 times 5, his response is supposed to be 20, and I tell him that's true. He is going to intuit, he is going to feel, he is going to believe everything in his soul, if you want to get to that part, that is the correct answer. So at the same time, when you're saying that you feel because of whatever your conditioning was, or whatever your genetic makeup is, or whatever God implanted on your heart, that torturing babies for fun is wrong, is the exact same thing, and we can correlate.
Okay, not at all. Not at all.
Why not?
Okay, because when we're talking about internal justifications, they are sufficient until you have an overriding defeater. When you have 5 times 5 equals 20, you have a pretty obvious defeater, and that's if you work the math out, it does not equal 20.
Great point, and that's why I'm providing the defeater.
What's the defeater?
The defeater to 2 is that when you claim that these are moral absolutes almost,
I'm not saying they're absolutes.
Okay, however you want to phrase it, that we intuit that torturing babies for fun is wrong, and you hang on that is a knowledge claim, capital K knowledge, okay, in that we know that is wrong. At the same time, not giving a, okay, I mean, if you want to, we can back it up, and I can demonstrate how you would even agree that torturing babies for fun would not be wrong. And I mean, I don't know if you would go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah,
but we can go down that.
Yeah, because what you said wasn't a defeater. You were challenging a piece of evidence that Wade gave, but to do that wouldn't be a defeater of the claim, in the same way that you could have a defeater of 5 times 5 equals 20.
Well, exactly. But I didn't think you guys want to go that far down the hole. I tried to do the basically overarching thing of saying, look, you can't make that claim that torturing babies for pleasure is wrong in every case across the board, even from a subjective sense, and claim that as knowledge. I'm not saying that it's an absolutist or objective claim. I'm saying that for you to say that somehow justifies and carries with it knowledge, I don't see how you get there when we know that there are, albeit outlier events, that would completely change that and flip it on its head. And I mean, again, if you want to go down the examples, we can, if that helps, but it's going to be a few minutes to ferret that out.
I want to ask Sombrero Man something. Sombrero Man, before you came in, we were talking about premise 1. I don't know if you want to go down that. If you do, then we'll do it. If not, then maybe we'll go down Ned's path or start to close it up soon.
I'm not sure what premise 1 is, because I don't know what the formulation that you're
Okay, so premise 1, the argument is this. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. Premise 2, moral knowledge does exist. Conclusion, therefore God exists.
So premise 1 is
if God does not exist, moral knowledge.
Moral knowledge only exists with God existing.
Well, no, it's if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. So in this case, it would suffice to show that given that God does not exist, it's very likely that we do not have moral knowledge. That would suffice to show that the first premise is at least probably true.
Yeah, so Sombrero Man, I don't know if we want to talk about that.
Well, I can very briefly. The idea is that moral oughtness on atheism, we would have the intuitions for morality existing, regardless of whether or not morality existed. And this would undercut intuition as a source of warrant. And in practice, we believe morality exists on the basis of intuition. The analogy I gave for that was this. Suppose the cyborg has an implant in her brain such that when she has a metallic-containing widget in her hand, that implant delivers the intuition that the widget contains metal, and she believes that it contains metal on the basis of that intuition. If that implant were to malfunction such that it would give the intuition that the widget contained metal, regardless of whether it contained metal, then that implant would not, if she believed it on the basis of intuition, that intuition would not deliver a warrant for her belief. Especially if she figured out later that, oh, the implant that I'm getting would give me the intuition that it contains metal, regardless of whether it contained metal. Then she would even have a defeater for her belief that the widget contains metal, if she believed it on the basis of intuition.
So how are you defining moral knowledge in this case? Because I keep having, I believe his name is Jack. I didn't catch his name, but I keep having his example in the back of my head that, you know, every time you're talking about intuition, it's mostly like, ew, I don't like this, or yay, I do like this. It's just more of an emotional response. So how are you defining knowledge?
It's something more direct than that. Just like it seems to me that the external world is real. Similarly, it seems to me that torturing innocent sentient life just for fun, ceteris paribus, is something that we ought not to do.
I see. So, but my question was that, like, what is your definition of moral knowledge, though?
Knowledge, I suppose we could define it as properly justified true belief. Notice, before you say get here, I did use the adverb properly.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's knowledge, but again, what do you mean about moral knowledge, though? That's the thing that's
there are some moral propositions we know that to be true. At least one moral proposition that we know to be true.
See, so the reason that I don't like the way that this is formulated is specifically because the way that, or what you said earlier about there being moral intuitions, irrespective of what you think about the existence of God or not, it seems to me that we can actually have those same experiences, revulsion of babies being tortured, for example. You can still have that whether or not you're an atheist or whether you're a theist, or sorry, whether or not atheism or theism are in fact true. Like, it doesn't seem to me that God is necessary to explain the existence of that revulsion. So that's why I'm concerned about the moral knowledge part, because of that whole issue. I would be more comfortable with saying something to the effect of, you know, if God did not exist, then maybe then moral realism would be false, you know, something like that.
Well, because that's not quite the argument. It's a little bit more modest than that. I mean, I don't think.
I think it's actually a little bit stronger than that, because you're saying that not only that if God does not exist, not only is moral realism false, but we can't have any experiences.
That's not the argument. The argument is that if atheism is true, this intuition that we have for morality's existence is delusory.
Yeah.
Or, well, intuition doesn't deliver one for morality. Well, okay, more than that.
Yeah.
If God doesn't exist, then we don't have moral knowledge. So that even if there were such a thing as morality, we don't really know it. We wouldn't really know it to be true.
Yeah, that's what the problem is here. Because, and I'll be frank, that I am a theist. Like, I do agree that God does exist, but I'm not necessarily sure that this argument in its form is successful. The way that you framed it as an epistemic question, because I think that it's very much open to most of the attacks that were just made. Do we in fact have moral knowledge? You know, things like that. But I think if you reframe it as an ontological question, as can you have such things as objective morals or objective values or objective duties or what have you? Can you have those kinds of things in a universe without God? That's a more interesting question, I think that's a much more direct question, and one that's a little bit more. It may be a little less practical, but I think it's more defensible that way.
Well,
because you can actually invert it. The way that you have it phrased right here, so you've got not God entails no knowledge. Well, you could reverse that. I think De Morgan's rule is the fancy term for that, which is moral knowledge entails that there is a God.
Because modus tollens.
Yeah, perhaps. Okay, but if you've but depending on how you define that moral knowledge, though, I don't know that that's actually valid. Because if you've defined moral knowledge as having an intuition of the moral realm, I think that phenomenon can actually be consistent. You can still have that phenomenon without entailing something about the existence of God.
No, that's not the definition of moral knowledge I was using.
Okay. Okay, so your definition of moral knowledge is an intuition that the moral realm is real? Is that what it is?
No.
Okay. Then give it again. So properly justify true belief about the moral realm. Is that?
Yeah. That we know, for example, that it's morally. There is at least one moral proposition that we know to be true, like torturing infants just for fun. That's morally wrong, and we know that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun, for example.
Okay, and how is that properly justified? Like, give me just a smorgasbord of how that can be properly justified.
Right. Well, one way it could be justified is that God knows that it's true and designed our cognitive faculties in such a way that when we are functioning properly, we intuitively apprehend that it's true, such that it's sort of God-given intuitive knowledge. That's one way it could happen.
Okay.
Wait.
But then isn't the conclusion of your
hold on.
kind
Zach,
of
do you mean
superfluous?
how you know that premise 1 is true? Is that what you mean?
No. That's not what I'm saying. Okay. Here's where I'm going. Here's the full argument that I'm trying to make. What I suspect, I don't know if this is true, that's why I'm asking questions, but what I suspect is that whenever you make that statement, you cannot have a properly justified true belief about a moral claim. I think that once you dig down deeper on the types of justification that you have, you're going to end up with either you're going to end up with one of two justifications. Either you have some type of intuition about it being true, or and that's what justifies your belief, or you're going to have some sort of divine revelation, and that's what justifies it. That's what I'm suspecting. And the reason that I think that that's suspicious is because the first one of those options there, the intuition, that's a phenomenon that is consistent with either atheism, naturalism, theism, polytheism. Like, you can have that phenomenon in any world with cognitively well-developed creatures. Even if their cognitive faculties are not operating properly, they can still, in fact, have that same phenomenon.
Right. That's actually part of my argument.
Right.
So the idea is that premise 2 is like, okay, we do have moral knowledge. That's premise 2. Premise 1, is that the justification for premise 1 is that, okay, if atheism is true, in practice, we believe in moral knowledge on the basis of intuition. However, if atheism were true, that intuition would not deliver a warrant for our moral beliefs.
Okay.
Zach, would there be a better way to I mean, not to pick on Wade, but would there be a way to formulate that you would find more defensible?
Sure. So here's where my concern is, and I'm having a hard time expressing it. But the concern that I have is whenever you start making knowledge claims, that adds a whole layer of epistemic controversies that you've got to sort out, and those are things that I think convolute and muddy the waters. Whereas we can actually separate this into two separate questions and ask, are moral duties, or objective moral duties, the kinds of things that require something like a God to exist? That's actually an interesting question there. And then the separate question is, do we actually apprehend those things or not? And so I think that by saying that God is necessary for moral knowledge, all that does is add another layer of confusion.
I didn't actually say that he was necessary for moral knowledge.
What's your argument then?
Okay, fine. Say that, okay, well, hold on just a minute, hold on. If God is not necessary for moral knowledge, then I don't see how your argument follows through, because you just said that if there is no God, then there is no moral knowledge.
Yeah, okay, so remember, I didn't say that moral knowledge can't exist if God doesn't exist. I'm saying moral knowledge doesn't exist if God doesn't exist. So, a little bit different.
Okay, so is there a possible world where there is no God and there is moral knowledge?
For all this argument cares, there is such a possible world. I personally don't believe there is, but the first premise is non-committal.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I don't know that makes sense. But anyway.
Well, here's how.
It really doesn't.
No, there's a theorem of mathematics and propositional logic such that if given A, C is probably true, then probably if A, then C.
Okay.
If you're using if A, then C as a material implication. That's a theorem of mathematics.
Okay. All right. I can't resist this. Okay. If there is such a possible world where there does exist, or there exists no God, and there also exists moral knowledge, then how do you know that that world isn't the actual world?
Well, you don't know that for certain, just like you don't know for...
So you just admitted that your argument is uncertain. You're uncertain about the conclusion.
You dropped the ball when you said there's a possible world.
Yeah.
Your argument doesn't work.
So,
well, sure, just like there's a possible world where I'm a brain in a vat. I'm not saying I'm not saying first premise is
now wait a minute.
I'm just saying that it's probably true.
Okay, so what you've done now, okay, your argument's really falling apart now, because what you've done is you've taken a deductive argument and you've backed it down into an inductive argument, Like, you haven't actually, you didn't say that your justification for premise 1 is inductive. You've made your actual argument itself a probability argument.
Yeah.
Well, the
I don't see
argument,
how
which
there could
defeats
be
the purpose.
I don't see how there could be inductive evidence for
Okay, you know,
the premises.
And not only that, but by saying that, by making the equation that there's a possible world where you're bringing a vat, now you've turned this whole argument on its head, because I can say that you're presupposing not only do you intuit that there are objective moral values, but you also intuit that there is a God that is somehow related to those moral values.
okay, normally when you're making deductive arguments in philosophy, you don't necessarily have to know that the premises are true with absolute certainty. Otherwise, very few philosophical arguments meet that standard. But I do think we have good grounds for thinking that given atheism, it is unlikely that we do have moral knowledge. If that is the case, then the first premise is probably true.
Okay. Yeah, I got that, but that's not actually what you're saying, though. Because
that is what I'm saying. I do believe that the premises are probably true. I concede that we don't know the premises are true with absolute certainty, but that's not, I don't think you need that requirement to have a good argument.
Yeah, I agree with you. However, I think what you've done is, rather than indexing your certainty about the propositions, you've actually indexed the probability of the propositions themselves. In other words, you're not saying it's probably true that if there is no God, then there is no moral knowledge. What you're saying is, if there is no God, then probably there's no moral knowledge. Like, the objective probability of there being moral knowledge is what's being affected, not your epistemic probability of your certainty about that proposition.
No, okay. So, do you know what a material implication is?
Remind me.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
if A then C just means it is not the case that A is true and C is false.
Okay.
So, it's a theorem of mathematics and propositional logic that the probability of C given A, if that probability is high, then the probability of the material implication being true is also high. That's because the probability of the material implication being true is at least as high as the probability of C given A.
Okay.
So
I think I follow with you.
Huh?
I just said I think I'm following with you. So
yeah. So, for example, if given atheism, moral knowledge probably does not exist, then probably it is the case that if atheism is true, moral knowledge does not exist as a material conditional.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Okay. So, but okay. All right. I see what you're saying.
I can link you to the theorem if you want to.
No. I got you. I remember what you're talking about now. I do want to go back to my other question though. Whenever I was asking you about what you said about there being a possible world where there is moral knowledge and yet there is no God. I just want to repeat my question about, so what is your justification for thinking that's not the actual world?
Okay, so I gave an example of that cyborg scenario, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it seems to be the case that morality, that we'd have these moral beliefs even if morality did not exist. Now there are ways around this. So earlier when I first started, I pointed out that, barring some sort of supernatural intervention, this is the case. We could conceive of, for example, that we humans have supernatural clairvoyant powers where we can detect this non-physical stuff if it were not to exist. But that supernatural clairvoyant stuff, that sounds far-fetched. It seems unlikely. So to use an example, suppose someone has the belief that there's an invisible unicorn floating above my head right now. That claim is possible, but it's not plausible. I would be justified in rejecting that belief. It's epistemically improbable, even though I don't know it to be true for certainty. So the same is true with things like there's this unknown supernatural cause that causes us to believe that. Well, yeah, it's possible. We don't know that it's false with absolute certainty, but it seems unlikely. It seems like if this non-physical realm were to exist, it seems more likely that, given evolution and our physical brains giving us this intuition, it seems to be that sort of thing where we would have it regardless of whether it existed if atheism is true.
I don't mean to butt in, but that seems like you're arguing against your own point, or your own premise, or your own conclusion, I should say, because if you're going to say that there's this, it seems improbable that there's this outside supernatural force.
I said on atheism, that's what is likely true.
Okay, but what it sounds like to me is you're assigning these probabilities. Well, I guess that would be the question. How are you assigning these probabilities? Because as Zach pointed out, it seems that there's no way to determine which reality we live in. One that is dictated by the supernatural, i.e. your God, or it's purely atheistic, i.e. naturalistic. And other than just assigning these probabilities based on, I don't know, your intuition.
Well, how do you know that there's not an invisible, undetectable, invisible unicorn floating above your head right now?
I don't.
Well, in practice, it just seems unlikely to us. But if we were to delve into it a little bit further, that what brings about that intuition, we could go to kind of J.L. Mackey's argument from queerness, where if certain things have a certain deviations from the types of things that we know exist, it's qualitatively unlikely.
Which is exactly what God would be in what we see on a daily basis.
So would abstract moral properties, right? Those would be queer as well.
I would agree with that as well.
That was Mackey's argument for queerness, is that if J.L. Mackey, he was an atheist, and his argument was that, well, if moral properties exist, they seem to be queer. Although he doesn't spell it out, doesn't explain it in the same way that I did, that invisible unicorn thing. That does seem to be his thinking behind it when I read his work.
But again,
wait a minute. Wait, hold on. I need to butt in here because the original question is related to premise 1. And if I understand you correctly, your argument is it seems peculiar that there would be a world with moral, objective moral truths, but without some type of divine being. Is that what you're arguing? That that's just kind of a peculiar thing?
Well, not quite. I'm saying that I pointed out earlier, and when this video first began, that if God does not exist, if atheism is true, then basically the only way we would know that these moral properties exist is through some sort of supernatural intervention, because moral oughtness is invisible, non-physical, and causally inert, barring the supernatural. We need some sort of supernatural intervention, like, for example, us having supernatural clairvoyant powers. But on atheism, and given our background knowledge, that sort of supernatural intervention for our moral knowledge seems unlikely. It seems like supernatural clairvoyance seems far-fetched. It doesn't seem plausible.
Why would it have to be supernatural?
Okay.
Yeah. Jack pointed out an issue where it could just be non-natural.
Yeah.
No, okay. So how I'm defining supernatural is such that non-physical forces causally affecting the physical world would be supernatural. That was the definition of supernatural I was using. So if we use
morality,
but that's consistent with atheism.
It's consistent. You could believe in supernatural powers on atheism, but the idea that we would have, for example, supernatural clairvoyance seems far-fetched to me. Maybe that's phenomenon. That isn't the case.
It's not a question of clairvoyance if sensibility theory is true, right?
But it's also just as, let's say, queer to have a God exist. If you're going to say that our supernatural intuition is unlikely because it's, it falls along these lines, then you're in essence arguing that same argument can work exactly toward God and its existence.
I don't actually agree with that. So let's suppose for a moment that this argument works. Just grant that for the sake of charity. Let's suppose it seems queer that in that argument works. Then you go through the whole deduction. Then you come to the conclusion that God exists. It wouldn't matter if God exists seems queer because it's at the bottom of this deductive argument. Induced from the premises. So I don't agree that you could drop.
Well, I think the problem is, right, if he's saying that the only way human beings could have could have moral knowledge is if God designed them to have it, that would seem to preclude God having moral knowledge, right?
No, that wasn't the claim I made, though. Nowhere was that part of my claim.
So I thought your claim was that if moral knowledge is possible, right, that would imply that God exists, right?
No, the first premise is if God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. The justification for that premise is that given that God does not exist, it seems highly unlikely that we do have moral knowledge. Not that it's impossible, but that it seems highly unlikely. So supernatural clairvoyance, we couldn't rule out 100%, for example. But it seems if atheists, it just seems that sort of thing would be far-fetched. Now,
and why wouldn't it be far-fetched that God has moral knowledge?
Well, God is a supernatural entity. He would have something like supernatural clairvoyance if he existed. He's supernaturally omniscient.
I don't understand. How does God have access to those properties?
Well,
I don't think I understand what you're asking. Like, okay, if you were to grant this argument, then with God being at the conclusion of the argument, then he would be the locus of moral values, right? So
no, that doesn't follow.
Couldn't you just substitute atheistic clairvoyance, supernatural atheistic clairvoyance for God, and make the exact same argument?
You could. I don't think it would.
I mean,
be
the
true,
properties are causally inert, right? So how does God have access to them? I'm not getting it.
Well, that really isn't addressed by this argument.
Well, yeah, because then we're getting into Euthyphro and all of that end of it. So no,
Euthyphro. This is an epistemic issue, not an ontological one, right? If the idea is that on naturalism, right, there isn't a plausible account for how human beings could have this kind of knowledge, right? It sounds like what he's saying is, what is a plausible account is that a being that had access to these properties could design human beings to know the moral facts, right? But see, God is not actually designed. So there'd be a question about God as to how God could know the moral facts. Right? It's the same problem that arises with Plantinga's warrant and proper function argument. Right? He wants to say that human beings, given on an evolutionary naturalist account, right? It's unlikely that human beings could have true beliefs, right? And so in order for human beings to have warranted beliefs, they'd have to be designed to have the cognitive faculties that could have true beliefs, right? But you see, God doesn't actually have a design plan. So for Plantinga, it would seem like, and he's conceded this, that God doesn't actually have warrant for his own beliefs, right? In which case, it's hard to understand how God could have knowledge at all if his beliefs are unwarranted, right? So it seems to me the same problem is going to arise with respect to moral knowledge in specific as opposed to knowledge generally, right?
Well, remember, I said that one way that we could, for all the argument cares, there could be a possible world in which we humans have supernatural clairvoyance of these moral properties.
But Plantinga could concede that as well, right?
And
in the case of the evolutionary argument for naturalism. So what you would need is some kind of clear disanalogy between the two arguments. So what would that be?
Disanalogy between what arguments?
The evolutionary argument against naturalism and your argument.
Well, in this case, this would be the relevant difference would be the supernatural. God would have supernatural knowledge of this sort of thing.
No, you're not understanding, right? You're saying that for human beliefs, moral beliefs to have warrant, they'd have to be designed.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Well, then how is it that theism confers moral knowledge, if not in virtue of the fact that God designs human beings to have truth-tracking?
It is a way, but I'm not saying that's the only possible way humans could have moral knowledge.
Neither is Plantinga. Plantinga is not saying the only possible way human beings could have warrant, right? He's just saying it's implausible.
Okay.
Right, so where's the disanalogy?
Well, on theism, supernatural knowledge is not implausible for God to have.
No, that's just begging the question, right?
Yeah.
The point is, right, if in fact human beings would be warranted in virtue of the fact that God designed them to have truth-tracking moral faculties, right? The question is, what would warrant God's belief that he had truth-tracking moral faculties?
Well, remember, I suppose for all the argument it cares, it could be supernatural clairvoyance.
I don't understand.
Clairvoyance.
You could have supernatural clairvoyance on atheism. You
Yes,
were
you
saying
could.
that was ruled out.
Okay,
Well, on
wait, so, hold on.
So if you're going to say supernatural clairvoyance is implausible,
Implausible on atheism.
why
And
would
our
it be?
background
Why
knowledge.
would it be implausible on atheism but not implausible on theism? What
Because
makes it more plausible on theism that there's
What makes it-
supernatural clairvoyance?
Well, what makes it plausible on theism is that God is a supernatural, omnipotent entity, and he would be able to do something like that if that being were to exist.
You're begging the question by putting the word omnipotent in there, right? Because omnipotent just trivially says that he has the power to know it, right?
I guess you're doing it.
No, you just asked an internal question. You asked an internal question, right?
He can't say that it's appealing to a normative principle to say that the reason why it's plausible for God to have the ability to do it is in virtue of the fact that he has the ability to do it, right? That's vacuous.
But
So
remember, you
can't give
asked
that
what makes it plausible
as an answer.
if God existed. Well, if God were to exist, he would be omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good. And so it's trivial that he would have the ability to know.
You're just arguing in a circle there.
Well, no, because you raised the question, why on theism would it be likely that God has this sort of knowledge? The answer is, sorry, what's that?
Do you agree that to say that the reason why God would have the ability to do it is in virtue of the fact that he has the ability to do it would be empty?
Why? No,
Okay.
that's not the way that I would say it. I would say.
I'm just asking you if you would agree with that was empty.
Yeah, and like I said, that's not the way that I would say that I would
Okay,
make.
so now the question is, right, if I say what makes it plausible that God would have that ability?
Well, because
right? It doesn't make sense to say that what makes it plausible is that God has the ability to do it.
Okay,
which is exactly what Wade said.
This is an
That's
internal.
exactly.
You are saying on
So
theism.
let's go back let's go to the top, right? Do you agree that to say that God has the ability to do it in virtue of having the ability to do it is empty?
it might be. Well, it depends how you define what you mean by empty. Now, you remember, you're asking.
Do you understand what a normative principle is?
What do you mean by normative principle?
So if I ask the question, right, if you were to administer a sleep potion, a sleeping pill to somebody.
And you're asking, how does it cause sleepiness? And you say, oh, it's by its dormitive powers. That's what you mean by dormative principles.
That's what I mean by dormative principle.
So
if you say that God has the ability to do it in virtue of having the ability to do it, right? That's appealing to a dormative virtue, right?
Well, that might be, but remember what your original question was on theism.
Let's just get agreement on that point. Is that appealing to a dormative virtue?
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so it's empty. We agree that that's empty.
Well, depends what you mean by empty. But if all you mean by empty is that it's a dormative principle, then yes. But remember what your question was. Your question was, well, what makes it plausible on theism that God would have this power? Now, if A is true, then A is true is in one sense empty. But it's a tautology. It's going to be true. Now, the fact that it's empty is sort of beside the point. The point is it plausibly true? Well, of course it's true. It's a tautology. It may be empty, but it still be true. Similarly, if God exists, then God is omnipotent, and you would have the power to know knowledge. Now, it may be empty in some sense, and may in some sense implied to a dormative principle, but it's nonetheless true. It follows by definition from what God is.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think the problem is with the question, not with the answer, because it's asking, like, you're doing an internal critique and basically saying, why is God like this? But the thing is, you're already doing the internal critique. You're saying on theism, and then you're raising the objection.
But what if we just say that atheism, in my view of atheism, moral properties exist and we can know them?
Well, you can if you want to, but that wouldn't resolve the probabilistic tension I noted.
Sorry.
Oh wait, JHC, what did you? I didn't get your point.
So if we're worried about internal critiques,
Mhm.
and we're not, and it's not allowed to kind of ask how God can know something, or I'm not saying you guys aren't allowing that question to
Well,
be asked.
no, it's
off limits.
not even.
Why can't I just stipulate that on my view of naturalism, moral properties exist, and we apprehend them?
All right. So my objection to that belief would be the only way we could have more knowledge is through supernatural intervention. And if naturalism is true, supernatural intervention does not exist.
Yeah. Also, when you're talking about an
Are you arguing against atheism or naturalism?
okay, so I think JHC said said naturalism.
Oh, you said naturalism? Okay.
I think so. I think so. So if we were doing an internal critique of naturalism, then we would accept the boundaries of naturalism for the sake of the argument. Like we would accept that the natural world is all that there is or ever was. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't argue about things within the natural world, like these moral objects that give rise to our moral beliefs.
Right. And on my view of naturalism plus, right, it's naturalism plus moral realism. So moral knowledge exists on my view, right? So now you're doing an internal critique. That's the boundaries of my view.
Okay, well then you have to tell me, like, what is it?
Moral properties exist, and there's no God.
Okay, are they material or?
No, they're immaterial.
Okay. So they're not natural. So they're not natural. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, it's naturalism plus. Naturalism plus at moral properties. immaterial moral properties.
Okay, yeah, that's just stupid.
All right, okay, so
so let's call it something different. If you don't like it, let's just call it atheism plus.
We don't need
moral
plus.
Realism.
Wait a second. We don't need that.
Well, I do, because what I'm saying is that what they're saying is that if we can't ask why or how it is that God knows these things, and it's just by stipulation. Well, that's easy.
Because,
I can just
but by parity of reasoning, you just said that your answer was stupid, Richard.
Yeah, you did. But the other end of it is why can't we, instead of taking out the quote unquote kind of supernatural realm of where these oughts come from, we say that through evolution, these are a self-emergent property of sentient life, or even somewhat developed life.
Yeah, that would be a better way to run the argument, I think.
Why would it be better?
Because then we don't have to worry about. We can go a purely naturalistic argument versus a supernatural argument.
But all I care about is that God exists and that we have moral knowledge, right?
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying that if we can get it to complete, if we can delineate and make two separate arguments that are completely non-dependent on one another in as much as we possibly can, because if we're going, let's say, naturalism plus, then what we're doing is we're saying that the supernatural exists. It's just how do we access it? Is it through a God, or is it through some atheistic supernatural, means? If we can just say on the God side, we give them the supernatural realm, and on the natural side, we completely take that out, it would, in my opinion, be a stronger argument that way. I mean, if we can come to one side or the other. You see what I'm saying, JHC?
Right. The point of this thought experiment was to say that if whatever view I'm espousing is open to a kind of internal critique by which one is able to ask questions that result in it just seems improbable, then it seems like I could do the same thing about God and omniscience and moral knowledge, right?
Well, exactly. And that's why I was asking Maverick before where he was getting his probabilities, because it just seems like he was hanging them on his feelings. There's no hard line. There's no hard source for his data. So to decide.
Yeah, we went over that before you entered the.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. He basically just conceded that the only reason why he thought it was implausible was because it seemed to be so.
Okay.
Yeah, so far it's just been appeal to intuition.
Yeah. Well, as far as whether there's something wrong with torturing infants just for fun, yeah. I can't think of a truth that's more obvious than that I can
That
think
wasn't the claim that I was talking about. I was talking about the claim that it's implausible that there could be non-natural properties that human beings perceive, right, that are value properties.
Well, I didn't disagree with that. What I said was implausible was the idea that...
When I say perceive, I was specifying that that was a causal relation as opposed to mere intuition.
Okay, so just so that we're on the same page, what I said was implausible was that on atheism, non-physical moral oughtness supernaturally causes something in the physical realm.
Yes, and when
And
you
by
were asked to justify that, you said it just seemed to be implausible.
Yeah, it just seems to be implausible, and that's where, yeah, we got to agree to disagree on that.
Yeah, so that's why.
That's an appeal to intuition.
Yeah,
that's where the appeal to intuition comes in.
Yeah.
But can't we just borrow your...
I did not anticipate that. That's one of the reasons why I like participating in these things, is that sometimes intelligent people can bring up things that I never would have anticipated to.
Wait, you should come in. You should come in them more often. Maybe I'll start sending you links when I do them, if you're interested.
I mean, you don't have anything else besides appeal to intuition, though.
But wait, I think JHC, you were going somewhere with that.
I'm sorry, with what?
You said that you were about to say something about how you could.
Yeah. So this is why it just seems not. It seems to me like you should agree that it's a very plausible account, that it shouldn't be weird, is because whatever those properties are that are doing the work for you in theism and moral realism, it seems like I could just subtract God, right? Attach those properties to something else or leave them out there and keep everything that you like about it and keep the exact same explanation.
Well, that wouldn't work, because how I think that we have these moral properties, how we have this moral intuition, is the physical processes in our brain.
What?
I think our physical process in our brain is what's giving us our intuition. I just also believe that it's God who knew moral properties and designed our cognitive faculties in such a way that when they're functioning properly, they give this intuition. So God created the physical universe, and the physical universe gives us the intuition. You subtract God out of the equation, then you get the same problems that I noted before. We would have this intuition regardless of whether it existed, because there's no supernatural force intervening.
Right. So you're saying it seems improbable. I get this. So you're saying it seems improbable that the physical universe would kind of like reach out to our cognitive faculties without some kind of divine intervention.
Well,
right? All I'm asking for you is that I keep the structure of that. I'll even call it improbable, but it's logically possible that structure exists, right? It's logically possible, not epistemologically probable, just possible, right?
It is logically possible. So
okay, look, I said it was Jack that sounded like true empiricism. I had to come in to find out who it was. JHC. He's the one that sounds just like true empiricism. Like, how can he not be true empiricism?
Hey, Kaiser Cube, do you have anything to contribute?
I wanted to know who sounded like him. It wasn't Jack, it's JHC, who sounded just like true empiricism.
I don't know who true empiricism is. I'm sorry, friend.
But all right, go ahead, JHC. Finish your position.
Well, he asked me a question, and I was going to answer. I think that I would agree that it's logically possible for that physical structure to exist in the absence of God. It's not self-contradictory. In fact, the view I was contrasting with was, I suppose basically that the physical world is like it is, that our physical neurophysiological processes are giving us intuition, but God doesn't exist. You take God out of the picture, but pretty much everything else is the same. And that's when I argue that, well, if that were the case, you wouldn't actually have moral knowledge for the reasons I explained earlier.
I disagree with that completely.
All right, so did you listen to the cyborg scenario? Were you around for that?
Are you asking me or Kaiser?
Hey, Sombrero Man, you there?
Zachary?
Yeah, what?
Do you have anything to throw in?
No, I mean, I kind of missed out on when JHC was talking about those non-natural moral objects, I think is the phrase he used.
Yeah, so that would basically be the justification on atheism, I guess, for moral knowledge on their.
I'm just, maybe I missed it, but I'm not sure why he thinks that moral oughts have to be non-physical.
Okay.
I don't.
So
Hold
I
on.
can explain
sorry.
that. So
Well,
it
can I
all
finish
goes back to
quick?
my moral semantics. So
Well, I think the question's about JHC's view.
oh, okay.
No,
Yeah,
no, I
yeah,
was talking about Mavic.
Well, can I at least just get to the
Okay.
end and then I'll shut up?
Okay, JHC, go.
So here's why I was making the point, right? So it shouldn't seem any weirder that the structure, like how the structure would work, right? It may seem improbable that it exists, given.
Wait.
atheism.
You said the structure.
Hold on.
You need to define that.
Okay,
you can't
guys.
just say the structure. You need to define.
Well, no, I'm copy pasting it from the theist, right? I'm just saying, like he said, our cognitive faculties, which may be physical, are tuned by God, right? So all I'm doing is I'm taking out creator tuning. I'm saying by happenstance, they just happen to. So it seems incredibly improbable so far, right? But the structure shouldn't be like insane. It's the exact same thing. It's just epistemologically improbable. Okay, so so now we have this logically possible but radically improbable view. Now, let's contrast that to your position. So I'm trying to tie this back to something we talked about at the very beginning. On your position, unless it's somehow more likely that God directed and connected these up in the right way, those two hypotheses seem to be equivalent. And the reason why I might say that moral realism is just as unlikely on theism is it seems like there's an infinite amount of ways for God to exist and moral knowledge not to exist, right? And you're just as lucky as I am, right?
I don't know. I'd have to take your word for it.
Like it seems logically possible that God exists, but it's false that torturing babies for fun is wrong, right?
In the sense of not being self-contradictory, yes.
Can somebody please answer this question just really quick? It's a really simple question. What culture do you know that exists has survived that has supported babies being tortured? Period.
Well, what would be the what follows from that? Let's say none. What follows?
Prosperity. The whole point of babies being tortured, first off, it goes against natural selection. It and definitely implies a specific reason why babies, or somebody would want to torture a baby. It would require a specific reason of a very narcissistic nature. It goes against anything and everything that would promote propagation of the promoting of life in any way. It's destined to die.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, like you take a look at like something like Spartan culture, where they'd abandon babies or they'd get rid of them or kill them or whatever. That was common practice. I mean, a lot of ancient civilizations
for fun.
For fun. Yeah, I mean they had no problem with it. I mean, who knows what. Who knows what their motivations were? But honestly, like the emotional state that they were having at that time is irrelevant to the question.
I disagree with that. I disagree with that completely. That's dodging the whole problem completely.
No, it's not. Think of it, and you can look at Central and South America with the Peruvian people, and they would take babies and bind them, leave them on mountaintops as sacrifices to their gods. The Aztecs and Incas would sacrifice babies on the temples. So yes, Saka is exactly right in bringing up those points.
And where are these cultures now in present day?
Yeah, but you know what? We're talking about ancient cultures here, and these ancient cultures didn't collapse because of their this behavior. I mean, for example, you take a look at the Aztec or the Incan cultures. That has to do with Western influence. Greek culture, like the Spartan culture, emerged into other Greek culture, which just basically just changed over time. It
that is such a crock of shit.
Okay, guys, you can find the genetic markers for all of those civilizations in us today. They didn't die out. They're part of us.
Yeah, I mean,
that is such a crock of shit.
Hold on. Okay, I think this is kind of hold on. hold on, Saka. No offense, guys, but I think this is kind of a silly way to talk about this, and I think it's kind of off topic, to be honest.
Do you mind if we hear what JHC was saying, though, one more time? Because he was kind of interrupted, and I would be interested to hear.
Okay, yeah, so let's do that, and we've been going for like 3 hours, so after I think we get his point and maybe a bit of an interaction, then we'll start to close down. So go ahead, JHC.
So I guess I'll just summarize and I'm gonna bail after I just make a super quick point.
All right.
If that's okay with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think Maverick is gone. Which
Maverick,
is
are you Maverick? Are you here?
And that's a bummer. So I guess I'll just summarize and leave it for everybody else. So just real quick, here's what I think some issues are. Oh, welcome back, Maverick.
Yeah.
So I'm just providing a quick providing a quick summary, and then I have to leave. But I want to try to get like some closure on my end. So I think that the argument is actually interesting insofar as one. So I kind of disagree with Jack a little bit. That my intuition is that if they're objective moral values, we disagree. He thinks that they could be. They could fit into an atheistic universe. I kind of think that there's some reasons to think that that would be weird, but that's okay. So anyway, I just wanted to say it's an interesting argument. I reject premise 2. I'm a moral expressivist, so I have like completely different reasons. So this argument I don't even think is intended for me. But but some other issues that I see with this is that it seems that we made a really big jump from whatever those pre-theoretic seemings are about moral knowledge, about like disgust to moral knowledge. And I'm going to just say like that move feels totally unmotivated to me.
I didn't make that move.
Well, whatever the move is, we didn't talk about one thing that moves to any evidence we have to the existence of moral knowledge, right? So I'll just leave say my piece on that. But I think that could be shored up a little bit at least. The other part, if God does not exist and moral knowledge does not exist, I think there's a lot of weird things going on there. I think that talking about like a priori probabilities is really difficult because from my view, both are logically possible. It's logically possible for God to sort of tie down moral properties to our cognitive faculties. And it seems like there are infinitely many ways in which that doesn't occur. So it seems a priori, if we're crunching the numbers, seems radically implausible and lucky as well. So it seems like they're both the same there. And that's what I was going to say. Now, it does seem that if you're already like a Christian theist or something, and you already have the belief that this is what God's intentions are, right? Then you have something like a good argument. But no atheist is going to grant that, right? No atheist is going to say that they understand what God's intentions are. So,
yeah, because it leads to impunity.
Okay. That's my summary. Interesting argument. Thank you for the discussion, guys.
Thanks a lot, JHC. I appreciate you coming in and talking. Hey, Modal Fatalist, I've been trying to find you on G+ because I wanted to ask you about resources for the necessity of the universe. So I don't know if I can find you anywhere on G+.
It doesn't show up if you just type my name in?
No, I couldn't find you, and I also couldn't find you in the Great Debate community.
I don't think I'm part of. Well, let me see if I can join it. 1 second.
Okay. Hold on. I'm just going to get the link to. I'll get the link to it, and then you can click on it.
All right. So can I answer the question that I don't know how? Okay. So, question is, why to believe that moral properties are non-physical, and it had to do with how I defined the moral terms earlier in this video. So there's a couple different types of ought. One ought is what we could call descriptive. It's the type of ought that is nothing more than some purely descriptive state of affairs. So an example of that would be, if you want to do well in school, you ought to study, just meaning something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. So that type of is descriptive. Then there's another type of ought where we could call prescriptive ought that is not a descriptive ought. It is prescribes and is not purely descriptive, as in you should not torture infants just for fun. So natural facts, like facts of, by natural fact, I mean facts that can be expressed entirely in language of psychology and the natural sciences. Examples of those would be the atomic number of gold is 79, Sue is happy and healthy, and so forth. So premise one, all natural facts are purely descriptive. That is, they can be stated entirely in descriptive language. Premise two, moral ought facts are not purely descriptive. It is false that moral oughts have no properties besides purely descriptive ones. That follows from the fact that they're prescriptive ought because they're not descriptive. Conclusion, therefore, moral ought facts are not natural facts. So that follows if our conception of what a moral ought fact is that it's a prescriptive ought, because by definition, those are the type of oughts that are not entirely descriptive.
So I'm not sure if I completely understand what you mean by prescriptive, but I would claim that all facts, if I'm understanding this right, all moral facts are descriptive, including the one where you say that you ought not torture babies.
Okay, Maverick. Wait, I have a question on prescriptive things. Would a scenario of you going to school and trying to excel in something in which you just are naturally no good at be a prescriptive thing? Like, let's say you want to learn how to play the drums, and you realize that you just don't have that talent, and you push it to the point to where you just bring it into an ultimate fail situation. Would that be a prescriptive factor?
No, that would be descriptive. Very, I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but very brief and very roughly, a descriptive fact is a fact that can be expressed in descriptive language. Facts that don't have words like ought or should. Those are the type of facts that are descriptive.
Right. So can I just ask you this?
I'm confused with I don't know what prescriptive is then. I'm sorry.
Okay, by prescriptive, I mean something that prescribes and is not purely descriptive. So, and now the moral ought, how I define the type of morality I was talking about in this argument for moral knowledge is that type of ought that uses the prescriptive ought. It prescribes and is not purely descriptive. So any type of ought that is entirely descriptive, like a hypothetical ought of a hypothetical imperative, that would be descriptive.
So a prescriptive ought is something where, say, you can't answer the question why you ought do this. Is that correct?
We could answer it, but it would be the type of ought that David Hume seemed to have in mind in his Inquiry of Human Understanding, where he says, how do you deduce what ought to be from what is? Now, if the ought were some entirely descriptive state of affairs, well, then it's pretty easy to deduce it, because ought basically is a form of an is statement. But if the ought is not entirely descriptive, then Hume's question becomes much more understandable. And he specifically had the moral ought in mind when he mentioned this is ought.
Well, that just sounds like some plagiaristic version of what is and what should be. I mean, that you don't even have to have any kind of religion or moral standpoint to even define such a thing. It sounds like just some plagiaristic hijacked term that religions adopted from science.
Okay, I think it's about time to close it down. But since we have had so much interaction in this debate, I usually don't do this, but I think I'll give closing statements to Wade and to one of the atheists. Does anyone want to volunteer? Anyone want to do it?
I will if you'll let me.
No, I think someone who's been participating throughout the whole debate. I mean, no offense, just someone.
No, none taken.
Okay, so yeah, we'll have Ned. Ned, you want to do a really brief closing statement?
Yeah, I mean, again, premise two is going to be the problem. Again, and the assigning of just kind of random probabilities, especially, I'm assuming you're trying to run this more on a mathematical standpoint. And once you get into that kind of the Bayesian type stuff, you've got to be able to nail down your probabilities. And when we can go even on a purely naturalistic side and assign our probabilities, we come out with the same outcomes on P2, which you admit, and it just kind of falls apart at that point. So that's where I'm having a hang up on this.
Okay, thanks. And Wade?
right, so the argument for moral knowledge is premise 1. If God does not exist, then moral knowledge does not exist. Premise 2, moral knowledge does exist. For example, we do know that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. The justification for the first premise is that, very briefly, that if atheism is true, we would have the intuitions that morality exists regardless of whether it existed, because moral wrongness is causally inert, non-physical. Whether it exists or not wouldn't change whether the physical processes in our brain that provide us that intuition. And the analogy I gave for why that matters is that cyborg scenario where if the implant gives the intuition that the widget contains metal, even if it does not contain metal, then that intuition doesn't deliver warrant for our belief. Whereas in practice, we believe morality exists on the basis of that intuition. If atheism is true, that intuition would not deliver warrant for our belief. And therefore, if atheism is true, we would not be warranted in believing that morality exists.
All right. This has been a pretty good debate. Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks for the debaters who came. I want to admit a bit of a blunder on my part. I didn't bring enough, I don't think, apologists into this debate, so I think Wade was a little outnumbered. Usually in a context like this, when you have a panel, then if you're kind of stuck on a point, someone else can jump in and help you out. So it might be on me that I didn't prepare to bring more apologists in, because, you know, with the great debate community, you never know what you're going to get. I could have one GDC where all the guys in there are just giving low-level, nonsense, regurgitated stuff that you find on the internet, and, you know, I can just steamroll past them. And on the other hand, sometimes I'll get guys like Modal Fatalist here, or Jack, or Joe, who raise more challenging objections. So yeah, with the GDC, you never know what you're going to get, and today we had some pretty heavy hitters in there, and I really appreciate you guys coming in. The moral argument is pretty much one of the favorite arguments of Christian apologists, so I'm glad that we were able to do this discussion. And yeah, thank you everyone for listening, and we are signing off now. Have a great night.